Hey guys, tonight we begin with the terrifying, messy and deeply unhygienic world of medieval medicine. A time when going to the doctor was often a much riskier decision than simply letting the illness take its course, and when the cure for a headache usually involved a drill, a leech or a prayer, but almost never an aspirin. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine the room is cool, the kind of stillness that settles over a stone house long after the sun has set. The only light comes from a single tallow candle on the bedside table, its flame dancing nervously in the draught, casting long, flickering shadows. Against the rough plaster walls, you can smell the wax, heavy and animalistic, mixing with the scent of dried lavender stuffed into your pillow to ward off bad air. The wool blanket is heavy on your legs, scratching slightly against your skin, grounding you in the warmth of the bed while the air outside the covers nips at your nose. You take a deep breath, listening to the silence of the village, the settling of the timber beams above you, the rhythmic beat of your own heart. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1348. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? You have a slight cough, and the village physician has just arrived with a bag full of rusty knives and a jar of leeches. In the modern world, medicine is a science. It is sterile, bright, and smells of antiseptic. But in the world you now inhabit, medicine is a philosophy. And unfortunately for you, it is a philosophy based on the idea that your body is basically a sack of 4 fluids that are constantly trying to kill you. There are no antibiotics here. There is no anesthesia. There is no understanding of germs, viruses, or bacteria. There is only balance. And the way to achieve balance usually involves removing large quantities of things that you would prefer to keep inside your body. The man standing at the foot of your bed isn't wearing a white coat. He's wearing a long, dark robe stained with the fluids of previous patients. He smells of garlic, stale wine, and old blood. He looks at you not with compassion, but with the calculating gaze of a plumber looking at a clogged drain. To him, you're a hydraulic problem. He puts a hand on your forehead. His hand is rough, calloused, and definitely unwashed. He nods solemnly. Too much blood, he says. The humours are agitated. We must open a vein. You try to protest. It's just a cough, you say. Maybe some honey tea? He shakes his head. Honey tea is for peasants who want to die. You, a person of means, deserve the best treatment science can offer, controlled blood loss. This brings us to the foundation of all medieval medical misery, the 4 humours. This theory, inherited from the ancient Greeks and enthusiastically misunderstood by medieval monks, stated that the human body contained 4 liquids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you were healthy, these 4 were in perfect balance. If you were sick, it meant you had too much of one. Fever, too much blood, hot and wet. Cold, too much phlegm, cold and wet. Depression, too much black bile, cold and dry. Anger, too much yellow bile, hot and dry. The logic was elegant, symmetrical, and completely wrong. But because it was written down in Latin books by men who had been dead for 1,000 years, it was treated as absolute truth. So the doctor opens his bag. The sound of metal clinking against metal breaks the quiet of the room. He pulls out a phleem, a small, nasty little blade designed specifically to puncture veins. He ties a tourniquet around your arm. You feel the pressure building, the throb of your pulse against the tight fabric. He holds a bowl under your elbow. Don't worry, he says. This will let the heat out. The sensory reality of bloodletting is dizziness. As the red stream hits the ceramic bowl, drip, drip, splash. You feel the room spinning. The candlelight blurs. The air feels colder. You're literally watching your life force being drained away in the name of health. The doctor watches the colour of the blood. If it's dark, he nods happily. Bad blood, he says. We must take more. He doesn't know that blood is supposed to be dark in the veins. He thinks he is extracting the corruption. By the time he stops, you're pale, shaking, and weak. You settle back into the pillows, feeling significantly worse than when you started. Excellent, the doctor says, wiping his blade on his robe. The balance is restored. But the humours were just the beginning. The medieval medical mind looked at the natural world, plants, stones, animals, and asked a simple question. How can I combine these things into a paste that tastes terrible and apply it to an open wound? Let's talk about the doctrine of signatures. This was the belief that God had marked every plant with a clue about what it was supposed to cure. If a plant had leaves shaped like a lungwort, it cured respiratory infections. If a plant had roots shaped like a foot, it cured gout. If a walnut looked like a brain, it cured headaches. It was medicine by visual pun. Imagine the absurdity. You have a headache. The doctor prescribes walnuts, not because they contain magnesium or healthy fats, but because it looks like a brain. You eat them. Your head still hurts. Eat more, the doctor says. The resemblance is striking. Or perhaps you have jaundice. Your skin is yellow. The doctor looks around the garden. He sees a yellow flower, maybe a dandelion, or saffron. Yellow cures yellow, he declares. He makes you drink a tea of yellow flowers. If you're lucky, it's harmless. If you're unlucky, he picks a yellow flower that is toxic, because nature often uses bright colours to say, "Do not eat me." But the most dangerous treatments weren't the flowers, they were the metals. Mercury. In the Middle Ages, mercury, quicksilver, was considered a magical substance. It was heavy, liquid, and shiny. It didn't act like other metals, therefore it must be powerful medicine. They used it for everything. Skin rashes, rub mercury on it. Syphilis, later on. Mercury, constipation. Drink a cup of liquid mercury. The sensory experience of mercury poisoning is slow and terrifying. It starts with a metallic taste in your mouth, like sucking on a coin. Then your teeth get loose, your gums bleed, you start to drool excessively, your hands shake, you become irritable, paranoid, confused. The doctor sees this and nods sagely. The medicine is working, he says. The excessive salivation is purging the toxins. He doesn't realise that the toxin is the medicine itself. You're slowly going mad because your physician is feeding you heavy metals, and as you lie there, clutching your bleeding gums, shivering from blood loss, waiting for the walnut to cure your headache, you realise that the medieval hospital isn't a place of healing. It is a place where you go to survive the cure. But the night is young, and the doctor has another tool in his bag, something wriggling, something wet. The leech, the leech. The very word sounds wet, doesn't it? It sounds slimy and invasive, a creature belonging to the mud, not the medical kit. But in the medieval world, the leech was the surgeon's best friend. In fact, doctors were often called leeches. If bloodletting with a knife was the nuclear option, leeches were the precision strike. Imagine the sensory reality. You have a swollen eye, or perhaps a localized pain in your knee. The doctor reaches into a jar filled with murky water. He pulls out a black, writhing slug. It glistens in the candlelight, expanding and contracting as it searches for warmth. He places it on your skin. You feel the cold, wet slime first. Then, the latch. It doesn't hurt exactly. Leeches have a natural anaesthetic in their saliva, but you feel the attachment. A slight tugging sensation. A pressure. You watch as the creature begins to feed. It swells, growing from a thin ribbon into a bloated red sausage. It pulses with your own blood. The doctor watches with satisfaction. "It is drawing out the bad blood," he murmurs. You try not to think about where the leech was before it was on your knee. Was it in a pond? Was it on a cow? Was it on your neighbour who died of the flux last week? The doctor doesn't sterilise his leeches, he just recycles them. It was a biohazard recycling program, and sometimes one leech wasn't enough. For a serious fever, they might apply 10 or 20. You would lie there, covered in feeding worms, feeling your strength ebb away, hoping that the balance would be restored before you ran out of blood entirely. But if leeches were too passive, there was always cupping. This involved heating a glass cup or a horn over a flame to create a vacuum, then slamming it onto your skin. The skin would be sucked up into the cup, turning purple and bruised. Sometimes, for wet cupping, they would slash the skin first. The sensory detail is the pop as the cup is pulled off. A spray of blood. A dark, circular bruise that lasts for weeks. You look like you fought an octopus and lost, but the most terrifying procedures weren't the ones that took blood out. They were the ones that put things in, specifically into the skull. Welcome to trepanation. If you had a migraine, epilepsy, or mental illness, which they called madness or possession. The doctor might decide that the problem was pressure inside your head, or demons, or bad air. The solution? Drill a hole in your skull to let it out. There is no anesthesia. Maybe a bit of poppy juice if the doctor is kind, or a leather strap to bite on if he isn't. You are held down by 4 strong assistants. The doctor takes a hand drill, a trephine. It looks like a corkscrew. He places the tip against your forehead. He starts to turn. The sound is the worst part. You can hear the grinding of bone inside your own head. It vibrates through your teeth. The smell of bone dust, chalky and dry, fills your nose, and then the sudden release of pressure, the cool air touching the membrane of your brain. Amazingly, people survived this. Archaeologists have found skulls with healed trepanation holes. The bone grew back around the edges, but imagine the recovery. You have a hole in your head. You're in a dirty room. The doctor packs the wound with lint, scrapings from old linen cloth, and perhaps a poultice of wine and oil. You lie in the dark for weeks, terrified to sneeze, terrified to move, praying that the bad air has left and infection hasn't entered. It was surgery as a spiritual exorcism, but not all treatments were surgical. Some were purely repulsive. The dung cure. Medieval doctors believed that strong smells could drive away disease. If you swallowed something foul, it would shock your body back to health, so they prescribed potions made of animal dung, sheep droppings boiled in milk for smallpox, pigeon poop mixed with vinegar for a sore throat, powdered dog feces for colic. Imagine the sensory nightmare. You are sick, you are nauseous, and the doctor hands you a cup of warm milk with lumps in it. Drink, he commands. It is potent. You drink. The taste is exactly what you fear it is. You gag, you vomit. See, the doctor says, the poison is leaving the body. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. The medicine made you so sick that your body expelled everything, including potentially the illness, but mostly just your will to live. But the most bizarre use of scent was the treatment for wandering womb. Medieval medical theory, mostly written by men, surprisingly, held that the uterus was a restless animal. If a woman wasn't pregnant, her womb would get bored and start wandering around her body, causing hysteria, fainting, and anxiety. To fix this, the doctor had to lure the womb back to its proper place. How? With smells. If the womb had wandered up to the throat, causing choking, the doctor would place foul-smelling salts under the woman's nose to repel it downwards. Simultaneously, he would place sweet-smelling herbs between her legs to attract it back home. It was internal herding. The sensory absurdity is striking. A woman sitting there, sniffing smelling salts, with a sachet of lavender at her feet while a doctor solemnly explains that her internal organs are just exploring. It highlights the profound ignorance of anatomy that governed these treatments. They weren't treating the body, they were treating a metaphor. But sometimes they didn't rely on metaphors. They relied on violence, the cataract couching. If you were going blind from cataracts, a cloudy lens in the eye, the medieval surgeon had a cure. He would take a sharp needle, he would pierce your eye, and he would physically push the cloudy lens backwards into the eye jelly until it fell out of the line of sight. Again, no anesthesia. You're awake. You see the needle coming towards your eye. You have to hold perfectly still. If it worked, you could see again, blurrily, like looking through water. If it failed, infection, total blindness, agony. It was a gamble with your sight, played with a needle in a dusty market stall, and as you lie in your bed, your arm throbbing from the bloodletting, your stomach turning from the dung potion, your head aching, but thankfully undrilled, you realise that survival in the Middle Ages requires a strong constitution and a healthy scepticism of anyone holding a sharp object. But the night isn't over. The doctor is packing up his leeches, but he has one more recommendation. For the pain, he says, handing you a small dark bottle. A sleeping draught. It contains hemlock, and opium, and henbane. He doesn't know the dosage. He just pours. Sweet dreams, he says. You hold the bottle. It smells earthy, sweet, and dangerous. Do you drink it? You hold the bottle. The liquid inside is thick, dark, and syrupy, moving sluggishly against the glass like molasses in winter. It smells of earth, wet leaves, and something sharp, like vinegar mixed with old wine. This is the dwale. The doctor watches you expectantly. He calls it a mercy. But you know what goes into a dwale because you've seen the recipe in the apothecary's book. It isn't just herbs, it is a cocktail of poisons held in suspension by blind faith. Gall of a boar, hemlock, opium, henbane, wild celery, vinegar. The boar bile is there to make it bitter, to shock the system. The hemlock is there to paralyse your muscles. The opium is there to drown your mind. The henbane is there to make you forget why you were screaming. It is a chemical gamble. If the apothecary added too much hemlock, your heart stops. If he added too little opium, you're paralysed but fully awake to feel the knife. The difference between a surgeon and an executioner in this moment is the steadiness of the hand that poured the mix. You take a sip, it tastes foul, bitter, metallic, cloying. It coats your tongue. You feel a numbness spreading through your lips, then your throat. Your eyelids grow heavy. The room begins to swim. The candle flame elongates into a streak of gold. This was medieval anaesthesia. It wasn't precise. It was a sledgehammer to the nervous system. But if you refused the dwale, if you decided to brave the surgery with your wits about you, then you faced the soporific sponge. This was the leet version. A sea sponge soaked in opium, mandrake and hemlock juice, dried in the sun. When surgery began, the doctor would dip it in hot water and hold it over your nose. You would breathe in the steam. The sensory reality is the suffocating warmth of the wet sponge. It smells of damp ocean and toxic flowers. You gasp for air, inhaling the fumes. You feel lightheaded, detached, floating above the table, but the pain is still there. It's just further away, like a shout heard from across a valley, and you needed that distance because the doctor isn't just cutting. He is burning. Welcome to cauterization. In a world without antiseptics, infection was the real killer. A clean cut could turn into gangrene in days. To stop the bleeding and kill the corruption, the surgeon used fire. He pulls an iron rod from a brazier of hot coals. The metal glows a dull, angry cherry red. You can feel the heat radiating from it before it even touches you. It shimmers in the air. He presses it against the wound. Hiss. The sound is immediate and violent, like water hitting a hot pan. The smell is something you never forget. It is the scent of your own body cooking. Acrid, sweet, undeniable. But the doctor is calm. He believes he is sealing the veins. He is creating a scab made of charcoal to block the demons of disease. And if you had a specific, embarrassing problem, say, hemorrhoids, the medieval cure was direct. St. Fiacre is the patron saint of hemorrhoids. Yes, really. The treatment? A red-hot iron rod inserted where the sun doesn't shine. It was called the burnet. Imagine the sensory horror. You're kneeling. The doctor's behind you with the iron. You're praying to St. Fiacre not for healing, but for a swift death. It highlights the brutal binary of medieval medicine. The cure was often a form of torture designed to make the illness seem preferable. But let's move away from the fire and look at the wound man. If you walked into a medieval doctor's study, you might see a diagram on the wall, a drawing of a man. But this man is having a very bad day. He has a knife in his head, a spear in his chest, an arrow in his leg, a club hitting his arm. This was the wound man, a visual cheat sheet for surgeons. It showed every possible injury a soldier could suffer and linked it to a treatment. It treated the human, body like a pincushion. One of the most complex injuries to treat was the arrow wound. Arrows didn't just cut, they embedded. The heads were often barbed. If you pulled the shaft, the head stayed inside, festering. Enter the spoon of Diocles, or, in England, the Bradmore extractor. This was a piece of engineering genius born of desperation. In 1403, Prince Hal, the future King Henry V, was shot in the face at the Battle of Shrewsbury. An arrow struck him below the eye and buried itself 6 inches deep into his skull. The shaft broke off. The arrowhead was stuck next to his brain. The royal surgeons were terrified. If the prince died, they would likely be executed. They called John Bradmore a London surgeon. He didn't use leeches, he didn't use prayers, he used mechanics. He invented a tool, a pair of thin, threaded tongs. Imagine the sensory experience of the prince. He is awake. He is in agony. Bradmore inserts the metal tongs into the wound in his face. The metal is cold against the raw flesh. Bradmore expands the tongs inside the skull until they grip the inside of the arrowhead. He turns the screw. He pulls. The friction, the grinding of metal on bone, the pressure, and then the release. The arrowhead slides out. To keep the wound clean, Bradmore poured honey and alcohol into the hole in the prince's face for weeks. The prince lived. He bore the scar forever. But he lived because a surgeon treated him like a broken lock instead of a cursed soul. It was a rare triumph of mechanics over mysticism, but for the common person, you didn't get Bradmore. You got the tooth drawer. Toothache was the universal misery of the Middle Ages. They didn't know about sugar rot, though honey did its damage. They believed in toothworms. The theory was that a tiny worm was living inside your tooth, eating the root. To kill the worm, they would fill your mouth with smoke. Henbane seeds were thrown on hot coals, and the smoke was funneled into your mouth. You sat there, cheeks puffing, tears streaming from your eyes, inhaling toxic smoke, trying to suffocate a worm that didn't exist. If that failed, extraction. The tooth drawer was usually a travelling showman. He wore a necklace made of human teeth, the trophies of his victims. He set up a stage in the market. He had a drum beating to drown out the screams. He used a tool called a pelican. It looked like a hook. He would leverage it against the gum and twist. The sound of the root snapping, the crunch of the jawbone, the rush of blood filling the mouth tasting of iron and salt. He would hold up the tooth. "Behold the worm!" he would shout, pointing to the dangling nerve ending. The crowd cheered. You spat blood into the dirt. You paid him a penny. You were minus one tooth, but plus one trauma. And as you lie in your bed, the dwale finally taking hold, the pain in your arm from the bloodletting throbbing, in time with your heart, the metallic taste of the mercury lingering on your tongue, you realised that the body in the Middle Ages was a battleground. It was fought over by humours, by stars, by demons, and by men with rusty pliers. But the darkness is closing in now. The opium is doing its work. The ceiling beams seem to be bending. The sound of the wind outside slows down, stretching into a long, low moan. You are drifting away from the pain, away from the leech, away from the fire, but deep in the back of your mind a thought lingers. What if the doctor comes back tomorrow? What if he brings the clister, the medieval enema? The clister. Even the name sounds invasive, doesn't it? A sharp, clinical word for a procedure that was anything but dignified. If the doctor decided that your humours were blocked not in the veins, but in the bowels, he reached for the clister syringe. This wasn't a small plastic bulb. This was a piece of plumbing. A large metal or bone tube attached to a pig's bladder or a leather bag. It looked like a weapon. In fact, in some satirical drawings of the time, monkeys are shown using them as muskets. The recipe for the enema fluid was a pharmacist's nightmare. Salt water, honey, oil, herbs. Sometimes, if the case was severe, boar bile or vinegar. The sensory reality is humiliation. You're lying on your side. The room is cold. The doctor's assistant is preparing the mixture. It smells sharp, acidic, and warm. The insertion is mechanical. The pressure of the fluid entering your body is unnatural. You feel bloated, heavy, sick. And then the purge, the violent, the expulsion. The doctor nods. The blockage is cleared, he says. The evil humours are gone. But you feel hollowed out, violated. And the worst part, this was considered a luxury treatment. King Louis XIV of France reportedly had over 2,000 enemas during his reign. He would receive ambassadors while having one administered behind a screen. It was the height of medical fashion. But for the peasant, it was just another indignity. Let's move away from the invasive and look at the sympathetic magic. This was the idea that you could cure an illness by transferring it to something else. If you had a fever, you might catch a spider. You would put the spider in a walnut shell and wear it around your neck. As the spider died and withered, your fever would wither too. Imagine the sensation. You are sweating, delirious. But around your neck on a rough cord hangs a nut, and inside that nut you can feel the tiny, frantic scratching of a trapped arachnid. Scritch, scritch. It stops. The scratching fades. You check your forehead. Is it cooler? Or is it just the chill of knowing you have a dead spider on your chest? Or, if you had warts, you would rub them with a piece of bacon. Then you would bury the bacon. As the bacon rotted in the ground, the warts would rot off your skin. It was medicine by proxy, but sometimes the proxy was alive. The pigeon cure. If a person was dying, really dying, The doctors would take a live pigeon, they would cut it in half, and they would apply the warm, bleeding halves of the bird to the patient's feet. Also used for snake bites. The logic. The pigeon's vital heat would draw the poison out of the patient. The sensory horror is vivid. The bird fluttering, the knife, the sudden warmth of the blood on your cold feet, the smell of feathers and iron. It didn't work, it just wasted a perfectly good pigeon, but it showed the desperation. When science fails, you throw. Life at death and hope it sticks. But what if the illness wasn't in the body but in the soul? King's evil, scrofula, a form of tuberculosis that caused swellings in the neck. It was ugly, painful and common. The cure, the touch of a king. It was believed that the monarch had divine healing power. Imagine the scene. You are a peasant with a swollen neck. You have walked for weeks to London. You stand in a long line outside the palace. The air smells of sickness. Hundreds of people with open sores. The king, Charles II touched 90,000 people, appears. He is dressed in silk and velvet. He looks bored. He reaches out. His hand, soft, perfumed, wearing a heavy gold ring, touches your grimy, swollen neck. I touch you. God heals you, he mutters. He gives you a gold coin, a touch piece just on a ribbon. You walk away. You feel lighter. Is it the healing? Or is it the gold coin? Most people kept the coin forever. It was proof they had met the king. Did the swelling go down? Sometimes. The placebo effect is powerful, and TB sometimes goes into remission on its own. So the king got the credit. But if you couldn't get to the king, you went to the holy well. Europe is dotted with them. St. Winifred's well, the Chalice well. You would strip naked and plunge into the freezing water. The shock of the cold, the numbing of the skin, the gasp for breath. You emerge shivering, blue-lipped. You leave a token, a crutch, a rag, a piece of cloth tied to a tree, a clootie tree. The tree is covered in rotting rags, fluttering in the wind like ghosts of illnesses past. It was hydrotherapy mixed with hope. But let's return to the apothecary's shop, because he has a jar on the top shelf that contains the most expensive, most controversial ingredient of all. Mumia, ground-up Egyptian mummy. Yes, Europeans ate ancient Egyptians. The belief was that the bitumen used in the embalming process was medicinal. It cured everything. Bruises, coughs, pain. Grave robbers in Egypt would dig up mummies. They would grind the bones, the dried flesh, the wrappings into a fine brown powder. They shipped it to Venice. The apothecary mixes it with wine or honey. A pinch of Pharaoh, he says. You drink it. It tastes dusty, bitter, old. You are literally consuming the past. You are a cannibal of history. And because supply couldn't meet demand, they started faking it. They would take the bodies of executed criminals, dry them in ovens, and sell them as authentic ancient king. So you might be eating a thief from Cairo, or a murderer from Naples. It is the ultimate commodification of the human body. But sometimes the medicine wasn't dead. It was very much alive, and buzzing. Apitherapy, bee stings, for rheumatism or arthritis. The doctor would catch a bee with tweezers. He would force it to sting your swollen joint, the sharp, sudden pain, the burning, sensation of the venom, the swelling. The theory was counter-irritation. The new pain makes you forget the old pain, and the venom stimulates blood flow. It actually works, sort of. But it requires you to pay someone to sting you. And as you lie there, your feet warm from the pigeon, your neck touched by the king, your stomach full of mummy powder, and your knee throbbing from a bee sting, you realise medieval medicine was a contact sport. But there is one final horror, one that strikes terror into the heart of every medieval person. The stone, bladder stones. They were common due to bad diet. A stone would form in the bladder, blocking the flow of urine. It was agonising. A slow death by internal rupture. The cure? Lithotomy. The cutting for the stone. There is no anaesthesia. You're tied to a table. Your legs are spread and strapped high in the air. The lithotomist, often a travelling specialist separate from regular surgeons, enters. He doesn't wash his hands. He inserts a metal instrument up the urethra to find the stone. The metal scrapes against the sensitive tissue. Then he makes a cut, in the perineum between the legs. He cuts deep. He reaches in with forceps, or his fingers, and grabs the stone. He pulls. The scream. The sound of a human being pushed beyond the limits of endurance. He holds up the stone. It is jagged, yellow, the size of a walnut. "Out!" he triumphs. He doesn't stitch the wound. He just bandages it. You are left to heal or bleed to death on your own. If you survived, you were often incontinent for life, but you were alive. And as the sun sets on the surgery, casting long shadows across the room where you lie recovering, you understand the true nature of medieval resilience. It wasn't about being strong, it was about being able to endure the help. But the night is deep now. The doctor has gone. The fire is low. You are safe. The stone is gone. The humours are balanced? Maybe. Sleep. Tomorrow we will talk about what happens when the medicine fails, the plague doctor and his beak. The sun rises over a city that has gone quiet. Too quiet. The usual roar of the market, the clatter of cartwheels, the shouting of vendors. It's all gone. The streets are empty, save for the occasional cart piled high with shapes wrapped in grey linen. The air smells sweet, sickly sweet. It is the scent of rotting flowers, burning juniper and decaying bodies. You are lying in your bed, you feel a lump in your groin, hard, painful, the size of an apple, a bubo, and then you hear it. The tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It is a cane hitting the cobblestones outside. You look out the window. Walking down the street is a figure from a nightmare. He's dressed head to toe in heavy waxed leather. He wears a wide-brimmed hat, and on his face is a mask, a long, white, curved beak, like a giant skeletal bird. Glass goggles reflect the grey sky, hiding his eyes. The plague doctor has arrived. The sensory experience of a visit from this man is one of alienation. He enters your room, but he doesn't touch you. He uses his cane, a long wooden stick, to lift your blanket, to poke at your swellings, to take your pulse. He is terrified of you. To him, you are a biological bomb. He speaks, but his voice is muffled, hollow, coming from behind the leather mask. It sounds distant, like a voice from the bottom of a well. The air is corrupt, he mumbles. He's referring to miasma, the theory that the plague is caused by bad air. That is why he wears the beak. It isn't a fashion statement, it is a filter. Inside that beak, right in front of his nose, is a mixture of aromatic herbs, thyme, rose petals, ambergris, camphor, dried toad. He's breathing a personal cloud of perfume, believing that if he can't smell the death can't touch him. He is an early version of a hazmat suit designed by a poet instead of a scientist. His treatment? He pulls out a knife. He intends to lance the bubo, to cut it open and let the poison out. The pain is sharp, white-hot. The smell released is atrocious. He burns the wound with a hot iron to seal it. "Now," he says, backing away, "we must seal the house." This is the quarantine. If you have the plague, the town paints a red cross on your door. "Lord, have mercy upon us." And then they nail the door shut, from the outside. You're locked in with your family. If they weren't sick before, they will be soon. The sensory reality is claustrophobia. The windows are shuttered. The air in the house grows stale, hot, heavy. You're trapped in a box with the disease. But if you were rich, if you could afford the best medicine money could buy, you didn't get leeches, you got treacle, theriac. This was the miracle drug of the Middle Ages. A black, sticky paste. It originated in ancient Rome as an antidote to poison, but by the medieval period, it was the cure for the Black Death. It contained over 60 ingredients: opium, viper flesh, snake meat, wine, honey, cinnamon, fungus, and it had to be aged. For years. Imagine the sensory experience of eating theriac. The doctor hands you a jar. The paste inside is 12 years old. It is thick, tar-like, smelling of fermentation and old spices. You take a spoonful. It is impossibly bitter, cloying, sticking to the roof of your mouth. You're eating a fermented snake smoothie. Does it work? Well, the opium might make you care less about dying. But the snake meat? Probably not. But if theriac was too common for you, you could reach for the ultimate status symbol of the medieval pharmacy, the unicorn horn, alicorn. Noble families spent fortunes, literally the price of a castle, for a cup made of unicorn horn, or for powder ground from the horn. They believed that the horn of a unicorn would sweat if it came near poison. It was the ultimate safety system. In reality, it was narwhal tusk. Traders from the north harvested the long spiral tusks of the narwhal whale and sold them to gullible European kings. Imagine the sensory detail. You are a king. You are terrified of arsenic. You are holding a cup made of white, spiralling bone. It feels cool, smooth, organic. You pour your wine into it. You watch it closely. Does it bubble? Does the cup sweat? You drink. The wine tastes of wine. You feel safe. You're drinking from the tooth of a whale, believing it is the magic of a mythical horse, and if the unicorn failed, the bezoar stone. This was a hard, stone-like lump found in the stomach of a goat or an antelope. It is essentially a hairball that has calcified. Medieval doctors believed it was a universal antidote. They would drop the stone into your wine, or grind it up. Drink the goat stone, they said. You hold the grey, gritty powder on your tongue. It tastes like chalk and stomach acid. You swallow. You have just paid 100 gold crowns to eat a calcified hairball. It highlights the desperation of the era. When death is everywhere and science is nowhere, value is assigned to the rare, the strange, the exotic. But let's come back down to earth, to the treatments for the common cold, or a sore throat. Album graecum, a fancy Latin name. It sounds dignified. It means Greek white. What is it? Dried white dog poop. Specifically the chalky white droppings of a dog that has eaten a lot of bones. The doctor would grind it into a powder. He would mix it with honey. For your throat, he says. It tightens the tissues. The sensory reality. You have a sore throat. It is raw, scratching. You take the spoon. The honey is sweet. But underneath, there is a gritty, earthy texture, a flavour that your mind refuses to process. You're eating dog waste to cure a tickle in your throat. It creates a world where the cure is a test of will. How much do you want to get better? Enough to eat that? But sometimes, the cure wasn't something you ate. It was something you wore. The girdle of St. Margaret. If a woman was in labour and it was going badly, which it often did, the church would rent out a relic, a belt or a girdle supposedly worn by a saint. They would wrap it around the woman's belly. The sensory experience is the texture of the old cloth. It is velvet, perhaps, or silk, but worn thin by centuries of use. It is stained with the sweat and blood of 1,000 other women. It smells of incense and fear. You clutch at it. You pray to the relic. You believe that the physical object has the power to unlock your body. It was a monetization of childbirth. The abbey made a fortune renting out the belt. But let's leave the birthing room and go to the barber's chair. Because the barber isn't just cutting hair. He's pulling teeth, and he is setting bones, and he is performing the couching of the hernia. If you had a hernia, a rupture in the abdominal wall, it was painful, dangerous. The medieval cure, you lie on a table tilted so your head is lower than your feet. The barber pushes the intestine back in, and then he uses a hot iron to burn the skin shut, or he uses a caustic chemical to scar the tissue so it tightens. The smell of burning skin again. The scream. And then he bandages you up and tells you to lie still for a month. If you moved, the hernia popped back out, and the burn ripped open. It was a cycle of agony. But there is one final treatment we must discuss tonight, one that sounds almost gentle, until you think about the logistics, the puppy-dog cure for wounds or gout or arthritis. The recipe: take a young puppy, boil him with oil of worms, rose water and turpentine. You make a salve out of a boiled puppy. The sensory horror, the kitchen, the ingredients, the absolute disconnect between the cuteness of the animal and its fate as a medical ingredient. It reminds us that in the medieval world, animals were tools. Biology was a resource. Empathy was a luxury that often couldn't be afforded in the face of pain. And as the plague doctor walks away, his cane tapping on the stones, and the smell of burning juniper fills the street, you realise the greatest danger in the Middle Ages wasn't the bacteria, it was the ignorance. But the night is deep. The red cross on the door is fading in the gloom. You're still inside. You have your treacle. You have your dried toad. You are prepared. Sleep now. Tomorrow we will talk about the most dangerous place of all, the medieval kitchen, where the food might kill you before the doctor even gets a chance. The sun filters through the shutters, a pale, watery light that does little to warm the stone floor beneath your feet. You have survived the night. The plague doctor has moved on to the next house. The tax collector is busy bothering your neighbour about his windows. The silence of the morning feels like a reprieve, but then your stomach grumbles. A low, hollow sound that echoes in the quiet room. You are hungry. You head to the kitchen. It is the warmest room in the house, smelling of wood smoke and old onions. You reach for the loaf of bread sitting on the table. It is dark, dense, and heavy as a brick. It is rye bread, the staple of the peasantry. But as you break off a chunk, you notice something. Tiny black spurs sticking out of the grain. They look like little burnt seeds. You're tired, you're hungry, you ignore them, you eat the bread. It tastes sour, earthy, with a strange metallic aftertaste. Congratulations, you have just ingested ergot. Claviceps, purpurea, a fungus that grows on damp rye. In the Middle Ages, they didn't know it was a fungus. They called the result St. Anthony's fire. The sensory experience of ergotism begins slowly. First, a tingling in your fingers, like your hands have fallen asleep. Then, a burning sensation. It feels as if invisible ants are crawling under your skin, biting and stinging. The heat spreads up your arms, then come the hallucinations. The room starts to warp. The wooden beams of the ceiling seem to twist like snakes. You hear voices, perhaps angels, perhaps demons, perhaps the tax collector coming back for more. In severe cases, the blood flow to your extremities stops. Your fingers turn black. They wither. They fall off. You're literally falling apart because your breakfast was damp. And the baker? He knew the rye was bad, but he couldn't afford to throw it away. The size of bread we talked about sets the price, but it doesn't account for the weather. If the harvest was wet, the bread is poison, but it is legal poison. But let's say you avoid the bread. You decide to have some meat. It is late winter. The animals were slaughtered in November. The meat has been hanging in the smokehouse or sitting in a barrel of salt for 4 months. You pull out a piece of pork. It is grey. It is hard as wood. The sensory reality of salt pork is thirst. You have to boil it for hours just to make it edible, to leach out the brine. The smell of boiling salt meat is heavy, cloying, filling the house with a thick, savoury fog. But sometimes the salt wasn't enough. The meat has turned. It has a greenish sheen. It smells sweet, like overripe fruit. What do? You can't throw it away. That is a month's wages. So you mask it. You cover it in sauce madame or sauce Robert. Mixtures of vinegar, mustard, garlic and herbs. Strong flavours designed to punch through the taste of decay. You're eating rot disguised as cuisine. The rich, of course, use spices, pepper, cloves, cinnamon. Spices were worth their weight in gold, not just because they tasted good, but because they allowed the nobility to eat meat that would kill a peasant. They were the preservatives of the elite. But let's look at how you eat. You don't have a plate. Plates are for the king. You have a trencher, a thick, stale slice of bread cut from a loaf that was baked 4 days ago specifically to be hard. You put your stew on the bread. The bread acts as a sponge. It absorbs the grease, the gravy, the blood. Throughout the meal, the trencher gets soggy. It turns red and brown. It starts to disintegrate. At the end of the meal, you have a choice. You can eat the plate, which is now a flavour-soaked mush, or you can give it to the dogs, or the poor. To the alms basket, the Lord says. The poor waited at the castle gates to receive the trencher bread, the soggy used plates of the aristocracy. It was a trickle-down economy of carbohydrates. But the danger wasn't just in the food, it was in the container, the pewter pot. If you were doing well, you drank from pewter. It looked like silver, but it was cheaper. It had a dull, soft shine, but medieval pewter contained lead. Lots of it. And what did you drink? Cider, wine, ale that had gone slightly sour, vinegar. Acids leach lead. So, as you sip your cider, enjoying the sharp, crisp taste, you are also drinking a cocktail of neurotoxins. The sensory symptom is the sweetness. Lead acetate is called sugar of lead because it actually tastes sweet. Your bad wine tastes better because the cup is poisoning you. You get a stomachache. You get confused. You get the palsy. Your hands shake. You drop the cup. He's drunk, the neighbours say. No, the doctor says, it is the humours. It is neither. It is the cup. But surely the pottery was safe. The green glazed jugs. You see them? In museums. Beautiful, vibrant green medieval pottery. That green colour comes from lead oxide. They glaze the pots with lead to make them waterproof. If you put vinegar or pickles in that pot, the glaze dissolved into the food. You're pickling your own brain with every bite. But let's step away from the table and go to the water source, the village well. We talked about the well poisoning conspiracy, but the reality was mundane horror. The well was often dug in the lowest part of the village to hit the water table easily. Unfortunately, gravity works. The cesspits, the dunghills, the tanner's waste, it all flowed downhill, into the groundwater. You draw a bucket. The water is clear. It looks cold. It looks refreshing. But it smells faintly of life. This is why small beer was vital. You didn't drink water, you brewed it. The boiling killed the bacteria. The alcohol, even just 1% or 2%, kept it sterile. You spent your entire life in a state of mild dehydration and very mild intoxication. You were never quite fully hydrated and never quite fully sober. The world was always just a little bit soft around the edges. But there was one danger in the kitchen that had nothing to do with poison. The turnspit dog. This was a specific breed of dog, long-bodied and short-legged, like a corgi or a dachshund, bred for one purpose: to run in a wheel. To roast a large piece of meat evenly, it has to turn constantly. You can't have a human do it. They get bored, or they pass out from the heat. So they built a wooden wheel on the wall, connected to the spit by a belt. They put the dog in the wheel. They put a hot coal in the wheel to make the dog run. The sensory reality is the sound of the paws. Scrabble, scrabble, scrabble. The dog runs for hours. The wheel creaks. The meat drips fat into the fire. Hiss, pop, sending up plumes of greasy smoke. The dog is panting, exhausted, its tongue lolling out. The kitchen smells of roast beef and wet dog fur. It was a machine powered by a living creature. When the dog was too tired, they swapped it for another one. Every dog has his day might have come from the shifts of the turnspit dogs. But let's end this section with the most subtle killer of all, the adulterated bread. We talked about ergot, nature's poison, but what about the baker's poison? White bread was a status symbol. The whiter the bread, the richer you were. But flour is naturally yellowish or creamy. To make it white, dishonest bakers added things. Chalk, bone ash, alum. Alum is a chemical used to fix dye in cloth. It is an astringent. When you ate the pure white manchet loaf, you were eating laundry chemicals. The sensory detail is the gritty crumb. You bite into the soft white roll. It looks perfect, but your teeth graze against something hard. Chalk dust. Your stomach cramps. You feel bloated. The baker has sold you a stone disguised as a cloud. And as you sit there, your hands shaking from the lead cup, your stomach turning from the alum bread, your fingers tingling from the ergot, listening to the turnspit dog crying in its sleep, you realise the medieval kitchen was not a place of comfort. It was a laboratory of survival. But you have eaten. You are full. The hunger is gone, replaced by a vague, underlying nausea. And now you must sleep. Because tomorrow you have to deal with the sumptuary laws regarding your shoes, and the shoes are pointy. You wake up and the first thing you notice is your feet. They ache. Not from walking, but from the memory of the shoes you wore yesterday. Welcome to the era of the poulain, or the Krakow. In the late medieval period, fashion decided that the human foot was aesthetically displeasing because it was too short. The solution: extend the toe by inches, then by half a foot, then by 2 feet. You reach for your shoes. They are leather, stiff and unyielding. The toe doesn't end where your toes end. It continues into a long, tapering point that curls upward like a claw. To keep the point from flopping over like a dead eel, you have to stuff it. You use moss, or horsehair, or wool. You pack the end of your shoe until it is solid. The sensory reality of walking in poulain is the stumble. You cannot take a normal step. You have to lift your knees high, like a heron wading through mud, to stop the toes from catching on the cobblestones. You cannot run if a bear chases. You, or a tax collector, you are doomed by your own footwear. And if you are a noble, the toes are so long, sometimes 24 inches, that you cannot walk at all without help. You have to use gold chains. Imagine the scene. You're a duke. You attach a fine gold chain to the tip of your shoe and hook it to a garter just below your knee. You're literally leashed to your own feet. The sensory experience is the clink swish of the chain as you walk. You are a prisoner of style, but the king, seeing this absurdity, passed the sumptuary laws. Not to save your ankles, but to save distinction. Only a lord may have a toe of 6 inches, the law says. A commoner gets 2. So, you stand in the market. The shoe measurer arrives. He has a ruler. He measures your toe. Too long, he says. Cut it off. He takes a knife. He slices the leather tip off your shoe. You're left with a blunt, ruined shoe and a fine. It was a tax on length, a regulation of the silhouette. But if the shoes were crippling, the makeup was lethal. Let's look at the face in the mirror. Venetian ceruse. The ideal beauty standard was pale. To look tan was to look poor. It meant you worked in the fields. To look pale was to look rich. It meant you sat inside counting money. But how to achieve that ghostly dead white pallor? Lead. White lead carbonate mixed with vinegar? The sensory experience of applying ceruse is the mask. You mix the thick white paste. It smells sharp, acidic, chemical. You smear it onto your face. It dries into a hard, cracking shell. You cannot smile, or the mask will break. It covers your blemishes. It hides the smallpox scars. You look like a porcelain doll. But underneath, the lead is seeping into your pores. The symptoms of Saturnism, lead poisoning, begin. Your skin turns grey and withered, the very thing you were trying to hide. Your hair falls out. Your teeth rot. You get the gripes. Severe abdominal pain. You start to tremble. The cure? Apply more ceruse to hide the damage caused by the ceruse. It was a cycle of toxic vanity. You were literally painting yourself to death. And to contrast with the white skin, bright eyes. Belladonna. The name means beautiful lady in Italian. The plant is deadly nightshade. Women would distill the juice of the berries and drop it into their eyes. The sensory detail is the blur. The drop hits your eye. Cold. Then, a stinging sensation. The pupil dilates. It opens wide, making your eyes look large, dark and luminous. You look like a doe. But the light hurts. The sun is too bright. You cannot focus on anything close up. You're stumbling through the hall, half blind, knocking over goblets, your heart racing because the poison affects your nervous system. You look beautiful. But you cannot see who is looking at you, and if the makeup didn't get you, the structure of the clothes might. The stiffened bodice. Before the Victorian corset, there was the pair of bodies. A garment stiffened with reeds, wood or whalebone, baleen. It wasn't just for shaping, it was for armour. It held you upright. The sensory reality is the squeeze. You are laced in. The wood presses against your ribs. You cannot take a deep breath. You breathe from the top of your chest, shallow gasps. If you eat too much, pain. If you laugh too hard, pain. Medieval doctors wrote about green sickness, chlorosis, in young women. They thought it was a disease of the blood. In reality, it was often a combination of malnutrition and restricted breathing. The clothes were suffocating the wearer. But let's move from the wardrobe to the bedroom, not for sleep, but for warmth. The warming pan. A brass pan filled with hot coals placed between the sheets to warm the bed before you got in. It sounds cosy, but in a world of straw mattresses and linen sheets, it was a fire. Hazard. The sensory horror is the smoulder. You get into bed, it is warm, lovely, you drift off, but a coal has escaped. A tiny glowing ember. It eats through the linen. It catches the straw. You wake up to the smell of smoke. The mattress is on fire underneath you. Death by warming pan was a common entry in the bills of mortality. You were cooked in your own bed because you wanted to be cosy. But perhaps the most dangerous thing in the bedroom wasn't the fire. It was the walls. Arsenic green. Note, this is technically Victorian 19th century, but fits the boring history flow of domestic danger perfectly. Let's stick to the medieval timeline for strict accuracy. The green glaze on the tiles, or the vermilion paint on the wall. Vermilion is cinnabar, mercury sulfide, a brilliant, vibrant red, the colour of kings. If you were rich enough to paint your bedroom red, you were rich enough to inhale mercury vapour every night. The sensory experience is the madness. You sleep in the beautiful red room. You start to have strange dreams. You become irritable. You shake. The walls are poisoning you. And as you lie there, your feet throbbing from the pointy shoes, your skin itching under the lead makeup, your eyes blurry from the nightshade, and your lungs restricted by the bodice, you realise fashion is pain. But survival is harder. because tomorrow you have to go to the barber surgeon for a haircut, and he has a new tool, a dental key, and he wants to try it on you. The barber surgeon's shop does not smell like a modern salon. It does not smell of lavender shampoo or hairspray. It smells of iron, stale beer, and the copper tang of dried blood. You sit in the chair. It is a simple wooden stool stained dark by generations of previous customers. You're here for a haircut, or perhaps a shave, but the man standing over you, holding a razor that looks like a small sword, has a dual profession. He trims beards and he amputates limbs, and today he wants to show you his newest acquisition. The dental key. Before forceps were perfected, this was the tool of choice for extraction. It looked exactly like a large iron door key, but instead of a flat bit at the end, it had a hinged claw. The mechanics were brutal. The barber would hook the claw over your rotting tooth, the metal shaft would rest against your gum, and then he would turn it, just like unlocking a door. The sensory reality of the dental key is torque. It didn't pull the tooth up, it twisted it sideways. The force required was immense. You feel the cold metal against your cheek. The barber grunts with effort. Crack. It isn't just the tooth popping out. The dental key was famous for shattering the jawbone. It didn't extract, it demolished. You spit blood into a bowl of sawdust. The barber hands you a rag soaked in vinegar. Clean out, he says cheerfully. He hangs the tooth on a string in the window, adding to his collection. A garland of enamel and roots rattling in the breeze, and outside the window you see his sign, the barber's pole. We think of it as a candy cane spiral of red, white, and blue. Cheerful, nostalgic. But in the medieval world it was a literal advertisement for bloodletting. The red stripe represented the blood. The white stripe represented the bandages. The pole itself represented the stick the patient squeezed to make the veins pop out. After the procedure, the barber would wash the bandages poorly and hang them on the pole outside to dry. The wind would twist them around the pole. The sensory detail is the flap. You are walking down the street. You see the wet, red-stained linen spiralling in the wind. It is a banner of pain. It signals that this is a place where the body is opened. You shudder. You pull your collar up. But if the barber dealt with the outside of the body, the piss prophet dealt with the inside. Welcome to uroscopy, the diagnostic tool of choice. You are feeling ill, a fever perhaps, or a pain in your side. You go to the physician, a step up from the barber, usually university-trained but equally dangerous. You bring him a flask, a matula, a glass vessel shaped like a bladder. Inside is your urine. The doctor holds it up to the light. He swirls it. He studies the sediment. He consults a urine wheel, a colour chart that looks like a medieval paint sample catalogue. Olive green, he mutters. That means death. Reddish gold, he says. That means digestion. But looking wasn't enough. He uncorks the flask. He smells it. The sharp ammoniac scent fills the small room. And then, if he is a truly dedicated practitioner, he tastes it. Sweet, he says, smacking his lips. Honeyed. This was the diagnosis for diabetes, then called the pissing evil. The sugar in the urine made it sweet. The sensory absurdity. You're paying a man in velvet robes to drink your waste. He treats it like a vintage wine, rolling it over his tongue, looking for the flavour of disease. It was a science built on the palate of the physician. But sometimes, the problem wasn't in the fluids, it was in the speech, the stuttering cure. If a child stuttered or had a lisp, the medieval logic was mechanical. The tongue was tied. It was too tight. It couldn't move fast enough to catch the words. The cure? Hemiglossectomy, cutting the tongue. The doctor would heat a blade, or a pair of scissors. He would ask you to lift your tongue. Sizzle. He slices the frenulum, the little piece of skin connecting the tongue to the floor of the mouth. Or in extreme cases, he cuts a slice off the tongue itself. The sensory horror is the taste of your own cauterized flesh, the swelling, the inability to eat or speak for weeks. Did it cure the stutter? No. It usually made it worse, because of the scar tissue. But the doctor had loosened the organ. He had applied logic to anatomy, with disastrous results. And as you leave the barber's shop, your jaw aching from the dental key, your arm throbbing from the bloodletting pole, your tongue swollen from the hot iron, you realise that the medieval body was treated like a garment. It was cut, stitched, patched, and dyed. But there is one final indignity waiting for you at home. The love potion. You didn't buy it. Your spouse did, because they think you are losing interest. And the ingredients? Spanish fly? Spanish fly. It sounds like a dance step, or perhaps a particularly vibrant insect you might admire in a garden. In reality, it is a blister beetle, Litter vesicatoria, an iridescent emerald green bug that contains a chemical called cantharidin. Cantharidin is a blistering agent. If you touch the beetle, your skin burns and bubbles. So naturally, medieval lovers decided the best thing to do was grind it up and drink it. The logic was simple. If you drank a tiny amount, the chemical would irritate the body's exit points as it left the system. The resulting inflammation caused swelling and a sensation of heat in the groin. To the medieval mind, this swelling looked like arousal. Therefore, it was a love potion. Imagine the sensory reality. You're sitting at dinner, your spouse hands you a goblet of spiced wine. "Drink," they say with a hopeful smile. You drink. The wine masks the bitter, acrid taste of the crushed beetle. Half an hour later, the love kicks in. But it isn't love. It is chemical burning. Your internal organs are inflamed. Your kidneys are screaming. You're sweating, flushing, your heart racing not with passion, but with toxicity. If the apothecary got the dose wrong, even by a few milligrams, you didn't get a romantic evening. You got internal bleeding, convulsions, and death. It was a romance born of renal failure. But if the love potion was a lie, the stone of madness was a magic trick played with a scalpel, the lith of folly. Medieval people struggled to understand mental illness, depression, or simple eccentricity. Why was the village idiot an idiot? Why was the merchant so anxious? The answer, provided by travelling charlatans, was mechanical. There is a stone in his head, the quack doctor says, a rock pressing on the brain. The cure? Cut it out. Unlike trepanation, which was a serious, if misguided, surgical procedure, the extraction of the stone of madness was theatre. The sensory experience is the sleight of hand. You're seated in the market square. The quack doctor is dressed in bright, garish robes. He waves a knife. He makes a small incision in your forehead or scalp. You feel the sting of the blade. The blood runs down your face, warm and sticky, blinding you in one eye. The doctor digs around in the wound. He grunts with effort. "I have it!" he shouts. He pulls his hand away and drops something into a metal basin. Clink. The crowd cheers. You look in the basin. There is a small black stone. "You're cured," the doctor declares. But the stone was never in your head. It was palmed in his hand the whole time. He cut you, bled you, and took your money, all to perform a magic trick with a pebble. You walk home with a bandaged head, lighter in the purse, wondering why you don't feel any smarter. But sometimes the pain wasn't a trick. It was the entire point. The synopism, the mustard plaster. If you had a cold, a cough, or congestion of the lungs, the doctor needed to draw out the cold. He would take ground mustard seeds, hot, spicy, volatile. He would mix them with vinegar and flour to make a thick, yellow paste. He would spread this paste on a cloth and slap it onto your chest. The sensory detail is the escalation. At first it feels warm, pleasant, like a hot stone. Then it starts to tingle. Then it starts to burn. It feels like you're being hugged by a bonfire. The mustard oil is chemically burning your skin. The doctor tells you to leave it on until the skin is rube-faced, red and blistering. The pain on the skin draws the pain from the lungs, he explains. You lie there, tears streaming down your face, the smell of hot vinegar and mustard filling the room like a salad dressing from hell. When he peels it off, your skin comes with it. You are cured of the cough because you are now too distracted by the second-degree burns on your chest to notice it. But let's move from the chest to the ear purgative. Deafness was common. Infections, wax, loud noises. The medieval cure, pour things in, hare's bile, fox fat, eel grease. Or in one particularly disturbing recipe, the urine of a male child. You tilt your head. The liquid is poured in. It is warm, oily, and smells of the barnyard. It fills your ear canal, muffling the world even further. You hear the gurgle and pop of the fluid settling against your eardrum. You have to lie on your side for hours letting the bile work. Did it cure deafness? No. It usually caused an infection, otitis media, that led to the eardrum bursting. The sensory release of pressure when the drum bursts, followed by the silence. And as you lie there, your chest blistered, your head bandaged, your ear filled with eel grease, and your kidneys processing the Spanish fly, you realise that the medieval body was a resilient thing. It had to be, but the night is almost over. We have time for one last treatment, one that targets the very hair on your head, the lye bleach. We talked about the sun basking to get blonde hair, but if the sun wasn't enough, lye, potassium hydroxide, made from wood ashes and water. It is caustic. It dissolves organic matter. Women would mix a paste of lye and apply it to their hair to strip the colour. The sensory reality is the sizzle. You apply the paste, your scalp starts to itch, then it starts to sting. If you leave it on too long, the hair doesn't just turn blonde, it dissolves, it turns to jelly. Or your scalp burns, chemical burns, scabs. You wash it out frantically. You look in the mirror, the polished metal one, your hair is lighter, but your hairline has receded an inch because the skin has been eaten away. Beauty is pain. And as the first rooster crows, signalling the end of the medical night, you sit up. You check your limbs. Still attached. You check your teeth. The one left is loose. You check your wallet. Empty. You have survived the doctor. You have survived the barber. You have survived the apothecary. You are a miracle of endurance. But now you have to go to work. And the work is dangerous, because you are a gong farmer, and the cesspit is full. The gong farmer. In the hierarchy of medieval jobs, this was the bottom, or perhaps the deep bottom. In a city like London or Paris, thousands of people were eating, drinking, and relieving themselves every day, but there were no sewers. There were only cesspits, deep stone-lined holes in the cellar or the garden. Eventually the pit filled up. Enter the gong farmer. He was a creature of the night. By law, he was only allowed to work between 9 p.m. and 5 a.m, because the smell he unleashed was considered a public nuisance during daylight hours. The sensory reality of his shift is suffocating. You're lowered into the pit on a rope. The air is thick, warm, and heavy with methane and hydrogen sulfide. It smells of human waste that has been fermenting for years. It burns your eyes. It coats the back of your throat with a taste that no amount of ale will wash away. You shovel the night soil into buckets. Your partner hauls them up. But the danger wasn't just the smell, it was the vapour. Gong farmers frequently died of asphyxiation. They would hit a pocket of gas, lose consciousness, and fall face first into the muck, drowned in the waste of the wealthy. But here is the twist. It was one of the highest paid jobs in the city. Where there's muck, there's brass. They were paid per ton, and sometimes they found things. Coins dropped down the privy, rings, daggers. You're a treasure hunter in a sea of filth. But if the gong farmer dealt with waste after it left the body, the fuller dealt with it to make clothes. We mentioned the tax on fuller's earth, but let's look at the process itself. Walking the cloth. Wool, straight from the sheep, is greasy. To clean it, medieval industry used ammonia, and the best source of ammonia was stale urine. Vats of it, collected from doorsteps, saved in jars. The sensory experience of the fuller is the stomp. You're standing in a large wooden tub. It is filled with warm, aged urine. The smell is sharp, biting, making your eyes water. You put the woolen cloth in, and then you march. You stomp on the cloth for hours, barefoot. The ammonia breaks down the grease. The friction felts the wool. Your legs are stained yellow. Your skin is raw from the chemical burns. You smell so strong that you're legally required to live on the outskirts of town. You're making the king's velvet robes, but you're not allowed to stand near him because you smell like a latrine. And next door to the fuller is the tanner. If you thought urine was bad, try pure. Pure was the medieval term for dog feces, specifically white chalky dog feces. It contains enzymes that break down the collagen in leather, making it soft. The tanner would collect buckets of pure. He would rub it into the hides with his bare hands. The sensory reality of the tannery is a assault on the nose, the smell of rotting flesh from the hides, the smell of lime used to strip the hair, and the smell of excrement. It was a chemical soup. The tanner's hands were stained black. His lungs were filled with dust and spores. Anthrax was a common occupational hazard. Wool sorter's disease. You're turning a dead cow into a fashionable boot, using ingredients that would make a vulture gag. But let's leave the city and go to the mines. Because if the surface was dirty, the underground was deadly. The knocker. Miners in Cornwall or Germany didn't have safety lamps, they had candles. and they had superstition. They believed in knockers, or kobolds, little spirits that lived in the rock. If you heard a knock 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 in the tunnel, it was a warning. The roof was about to collapse. The sensory experience of the mine is darkness, absolute crushing darkness. The air is stale. The dust coats your lungs, silicosis. You're crawling in a tunnel 2 feet high, and then you hear the knock. Is it a spirit, or is it the sound of the rock strata shifting under the weight of the mountain? You don't wait to find out, you run. But sometimes the danger wasn't the rock falling, it was the air burning. Fire damp, methane gas. If a miner's candle hit a pocket of fire damp, explosion. To prevent this, they had a job called the fireman or the penitent. He would wrap himself in wet rags. He would carry a long pole with a lit candle on the end. He would crawl into the mine before the other workers. He would raise the candle to the ceiling to ignite the gas. Whoosh! A ball of fire rolls over his head. The wet rags protect him. Hopefully. He burns off the gas so the others can work. He is a human bomb diffuser, using a flame to fight a fire. And as you stand there, smelling the tanner's lime, the fuller's ammonia, the gong farmer's night soil, and the miner's smoke, you realise. The medieval economy was built on the willingness of human beings to destroy their bodies for a wage. But the night is deep. The candle is guttering. We have explored the doctor, the kitchen, the wardrobe, and the workplace. But there is one final realm of danger. The bed. Not the warming pan. The creatures in the bed. The bug. The bug. Simex lectularius. You blow out the candle. The room plunges into darkness. The only light comes from the dying embers of the hearth, casting a faint bloody glow on the floorboards. You pull the heavy wool blanket up to your chin. You are warm. You are tired. You are ready to drift away. But then you smell it. A sickeningly sweet scent. Like rotting raspberries or mouldy coriander. And then the itch. In the medieval world, sleep tight, don't let the bedbugs bite wasn't a cute rhyme. It was a tactical instruction. Bedbugs were everywhere. In the peasant's straw, in the merchant's feather bed, in the king's velvet-draped four-poster. They were the great equalizers of the night. The sensory reality of a bedbug infestation is psychological torture. You feel a tiny movement on your leg, a light scuttling pressure. You freeze. Is it a bug, or is it just the straw settling? You wait. Then the bite. Sharp. Sudden. You throw off the covers. You strike a flint to light the rushlight. You inspect the sheets. There they are. Small, flat, reddish-brown discs. They cluster in the seams of the linen. They are swollen with your blood. You crush one. Pop. The smell intensifies. A streak of red stains the expensive white linen. You're sleeping on a banquet table, and you are the main course. But what could you do? The remedies were almost as bad as the pests. The brimstone smoke. You close the windows. You place a pan of hot coals in the centre of the room. You throw sulphur, brimstone, onto the fire. Yellow smoke fills the chamber. It smells of rotten eggs and hellfire. It chokes you. It makes your eyes water. You leave the room and seal the door. You hope the smoke kills the bugs. When you return hours later, the bugs are dead, maybe. But the room smells like a volcano. And your lungs burn for days. You have fumigated yourself. Or you could try the bed staff. A heavy wooden pole, kept by the bed. Every night, before you slept, you would use it to beat the mattress violently. Thwack. Thack. The goal was to kill the bugs by blunt force trauma, or at least disturb them enough that they would retreat into the woodwork. The sound of medieval bedtime was the sound of 1,000 people beating their own furniture in a futile war against insects. But if the bugs were the infantry, the fleas were the cavalry. The flea, Pulex irritans, they were faster. They jumped. They lived in the floor rushes, on the dogs, in your clothes. The sensory experience of the flea is the phantom itch. You feel a prick on your ankle. You look down. Nothing. The flea is already gone halfway up your leg. To combat them, women wore flea furs, a tippet or a scarf made of the fur of a stoat or a marten. The idea was that the fleas would jump onto the animal fur instead of your skin, or the flea trap. An intricate perforated cylinder made of ivory or silver, worn on a ribbon around the neck or inside the bodice. Inside, a stick covered in honey and blood. The flea crawls in, attracted by the blood. It gets stuck in the honey. You're walking around wearing a necklace containing a slow, sticky death chamber for parasites. But let's look deeper. into the mattress itself, the pallias, a large sack of rough linen slit down the middle stuffed with straw. You didn't buy a mattress, you harvested it. The sensory reality is the rustle. Every time you move, the straw crunches. It is loud, it is dusty, but straw rots. It absorbs sweat, it absorbs spilled ale, it absorbs the damp from the air. Over time, the straw begins to decompose inside the sack. It generates heat, it grows mould, and it attracts mice. Imagine lying in the dark, you're just falling asleep, and you feel a movement inside your mattress, a lump that runs under your back. A mouse has chewed through the linen and is nesting in your bedding. You hit the mattress. The mouse freezes. You can feel its tiny heart beating through the fabric against your ribs. You're sharing your bed with a rodent. This is why you had to change the straw every season. You would drag the mattress outside, dump the rotting, bug-filled, mouse-infested straw onto the fire, and stuff it with fresh, sweet-smelling hay. For one night, the bed smelled of summer meadows. For the rest of the year, it smelled of decay. But the physical terrors of the bed were nothing compared to the spiritual ones. The incubus, or the night hag. We know it today as sleep paralysis, a medical condition where you wake up, but your muscles are still paralyzed from REM sleep. You cannot move, you cannot speak, you feel a heavy pressure on your chest, you hallucinate a dark figure in the room. To the medieval mind, this wasn't biology, it was a demon. The sensory horror is absolute. You wake up, the room is dark, you try to lift your arm, it is lead. You try to scream, your throat is frozen. You see a shadow in the corner, it is shaped like a goblin or an old woman. It moves closer, it sits on your chest. You can feel the weight, the crushing pressure on your lungs. You are suffocating. The demon is stealing your breath. You lie there, eyes wide, mind screaming, trapped in a body that refuses to obey, believing that a creature from hell is slowly crushing the life out of you. Eventually the paralysis breaks. You gasp. You sit up. The shadow is gone, but the fear remains. Was it a demon, or was it the cheese? Medieval doctors often blamed heavy meats eaten before bed for the nightmare. So you lie back down, you pull the wool over your head, you listen to the mice, you scratch the flea bites, you smell the brimstone, and you realise that in the medieval world there is no sanctuary. The field is taxed, the kitchen is poisoned, the doctor is dangerous, and the bed is a battlefield. But you are tired, your body is heavy, you drift. The sounds of the village fade, the church bell tolls the hour, you are asleep. Finally. Safe? Maybe. Until the rooster crows, and the summoner knocks. The rooster crows. The summoner hasn't knocked yet, but the village is awake. And today, the screams are coming from the house next door. Someone is giving birth. In the medieval world, childbirth was not a medical event. It was a gladiatorial match against mortality. And because the doctors, men, were largely banned from the birthing room, the science was left to the midwives. Now, many midwives were wise women with herbs and experience. But some were just impatient. Let's talk about succussion. If the labour was going too slowly, if the baby was lazy, the medieval medical mind decided that gravity was the answer, the obstetric shake. Imagine the sensory reality. You are the woman in labour. You are in pain. You're exhausted. The midwife decides it is taking too long. She calls for 4 strong men. They grab the corners of the bedsheet you're lying on. Heave! They lift you into the air and they shake you violently. They rock the sheet back and forth, up and down like they're sifting grain. The theory is that they can literally shake the baby out of you like a coin out of a piggy bank. The sensation is vertigo mixed with agony. The room spins. You're being tossed like a salad. If that didn't work, they might tie you to a ladder, head down, and shake the ladder. It was medicine by earthquake, but if gravity failed, they turned to chemistry. Sneezing powder, the midwife would take black pepper, or hellebore, a toxic plant, or castoreum, beaver gland secretions, and blow it up your nose. Achoo. The logic. The violent convulsion of a sneeze would force the abdominal muscles to contract, pushing the baby out. The sensory reality. You're in the throes of labour, and now your nose is burning, your eyes are watering, and you are sneezing uncontrollably. The room smells of pepper and panic. It was a biology experiment gone wrong. But let's say the baby arrives. You survived the shaking, you survived the sneezing, now the baby must be shaped. Swaddling. We think of swaddling as a cozy burrito for a newborn, but medieval swaddling was structural engineering. They believed that babies were naturally soft and malleable like wet clay. If you didn't bind them, they would grow up crooked. They would crawl on all fours like animals. So the nurse takes long strips of linen. She wraps the baby tight. She binds the legs together so they are perfectly straight. She binds the arms to the sides. She wraps the torso until it is a solid cylinder. The baby cannot move, it cannot kick, it cannot lift its head. It is a log. The sensory experience for the infant is total restriction. The linen is rough. It is often seldom changed. Urine was thought to toughen the skin. The smell of ammonia builds up. The baby cries, but it cannot thrash. It was a prison made of cloth, designed to force the human body into a rigid ideal of upright posture. But if the beginning of life was dangerous, the sudden onset of a new, mysterious plague was terrifying. Let's talk about the sweating sickness, Sudor anglicus. This disease appeared in England in 1485. It struck fast. You could be merry at lunch and dead by dinner. The symptoms, a sudden sense of apprehension, shivering, and then a sweat, a profuse, soaking, stinking sweat. But the treatment? That was the killer. The doctors decided that the sweat was the poison leaving the body. Therefore, the patient must keep sweating. If you caught the sweating sickness, they would light a roaring fire in your room in August. They would pile every blanket in the house on top of you, wool, fur, quilts. They would close the windows and the shutters. They would cork the cracks to keep the air out. Do not sleep, they would shout. They believed if you slept, you died, so they kept you awake. They poked you. They shouted at you. They poured hot herbal drinks down your throat. Sage, rue, vinegar. The sensory reality is being cooked alive. You're burning up with fever. You're dehydrated. You're crushed under the weight of 10 blankets. The heat in the room is suffocating. You're drowning in your own sweat. You want to sleep. Your body is screaming for rest, but your family is slapping your face, forcing you to stay awake in the oven they have built for you. Many people died not from the virus, or whatever it was, but from heat stroke and dehydration caused by the cure. But sometimes the cure wasn't hot, it was raw, the split sheep. For conditions like pneumonia or wasting disease, doctors believed in the transfer of vitality. They would take a sheep. They would kill it. They would skin it immediately, and while the skin was still hot and bloody, they would wrap the patient in it. Imagine the sensation. You are sick. You are weak. The doctor drapes a heavy, wet, raw sheepskin over your naked body. The inside of the skin is slimy. It smells of copper, fat, and the barnyard. It cools rapidly, turning clammy and sticky. You are wearing a carcass. The hope was that the animal's strength would seep into your pores. The reality was that you were just covered in blood and lanolin, attracting flies. But let's move from the whole animal to the specific part, the fox lung, for asthma or consumption, TB. Foxes were known for their stamina and their ability to run long distances without getting winded. Therefore, eating a fox's lung would cure your breathing. The apothecary would take the lungs of a fox, wash them in wine, dry them in an oven, powder them. You would mix the powder with sugar water. Drink the breath of the fox, the doctor says. You drink it. It tastes musky, gamey, wild. You're eating the respiratory system of a predator to fix your own. It is the logic of a child, applied with the authority of a university degree. And if the fox didn't work, the snail syrup for a cough. You take a garden snail, you remove the shell, you slice the snail, you pack the slices in sugar, you let it sit until the sugar dissolves into a thick, slimy syrup. Snail water, the texture, viscous, stringy. You swallow the mucus of a mollusk, it coats your throat. It soothes the cough, simply because you're too horrified to cough again. And as you lie there, sweating under the sheepskin, tasting the snail syrup, your ears ringing from the quinine, you realise that the medieval pharmacy was a house of horrors. But there is one final treatment for this section, one that targets the very blood in your veins, not bloodletting. Transfusion. Wait, did they have transfusion? Sort of. In 1492, Pope Innocent VIII was dying. His doctors decided he needed young blood. They didn't have needles, they didn't have IVs. They found 3 shepherd boys. They paid them a ducat each, they cut the boys, they collected the blood in a cup, and they made the Pope drink it. The sensory reality, the warm metallic taste of human blood, the desperation of an old man consuming the life of the young. The boys died from blood loss or infection. The Pope died. It was a vampire ritual disguised as medicine. And as the sun sets on the Pope's chamber and the sheepskin grows cold on your skin, you close your eyes. You have survived the birth. You have survived the sweat. You have survived the fox. But tomorrow is the feast of St. John, and they are lighting the bonfires. Bonfires, and the smoke is supposed to cure the cattle. But what will it do to you? The bonfires are burning. Bonefires, literally. Because originally they burned bones to drive away evil spirits, and smell terrible enough to annoy dragons, apparently. The smoke hangs low over the valley, thick, white, and acrid. It smells of calcium and charred marrow. You're standing by the fire. The heat is intense against your face, but your back is freezing in the night air. You cough. The smoke is supposed to be medicinal. It purifies the air. It drives away the miasma. But as you inhale the bone smoke, you feel a twinge in your chest. You need a doctor. Again. But this time you don't go to the university physician. You go to the wise woman at the edge of the wood. The cunning folk. She doesn't use Latin. She uses things you can find in the dirt. Her cure for your chest pain? Fried mice. Yes, for whooping cough or general chest weakness. She takes a mouse. She skins it. She fries it in a pan with a little oil. Eat it whole, she says. The sensory reality. The crunch of the tiny bones. The savoury, greasy taste of rodent meat. The tail. Texture. You eat it because you believe or because you're desperate. But if the mouse didn't work, she might try passing through. This was a ritual cure for rickets or hernia in children. She would find a young ash tree. She would split the trunk down the middle, prying it open with wedges. Then she would pass the sick child through the split in the wood. 3 times, at sunrise. The sensory detail is the rough bark scraping the child's skin. The smell of sap, green and raw. The cold morning dew. Afterward, she would bind the tree back together with rope and clay. If the tree healed, the child would heal. It was a sympathetic bond between biology and botany. But sometimes, the cure wasn't in the woods. It was in the graveyard. Skull moss. Usnea crani humani. Moss that grew on the skull of a dead man. Specifically a man who had died. Violently, hanged or beheaded. The theory was that a violent death trapped the vital spirits in the body, and the moss absorbed them. The apothecary would scrape the moss off the skull. It was grey, fuzzy, dry. He would powder it. Snort this, he says, for nosebleeds, or for epilepsy, the sensory horror. You're inhaling the fungal growth from an execution victim. It smells of damp stone and old decay. It tickles your nose. You sneeze. You're using the dead to treat the living. But let's move from the graveyard to the battlefield, because soldiers had their own medicine. Gunpowder salve. When guns arrived, surgeons believed that gunshot wounds were poisonous. They thought the powder left a toxin. The cure? Pour boiling oil into the wound. We mentioned cauterization. This was worse. This was deep frying the injury. The sensory reality is the scream, the oil bubbling in the torn flesh, the smell of cooking meat. But then, a surgeon named Ambroise Paré ran out of oil during a battle. He was terrified. He thought his patients would die. He improvised. He made a salve of egg yolks, rose oil, and turpentine. He applied it cold. The next morning he went to check. The soldiers treated with boiling oil were in agony, feverish, their wounds swollen. The soldiers treated with the egg salve were calm, sleeping, their wounds cool. He had discovered that not torturing the patient was actually better medicine. It was a revolution. But it took centuries to catch on. Most doctors preferred the oil. It felt more medical. But let's talk about a cure that targeted the most terrifying disease of all. Leprosy. The medieval world was terrified of lepers. They were the living dead. They were forced to wear bells to warn people of their approach. They were banished to lazar houses. But there was a rumoured cure. A dark, secret cure whispered in the back alleys. A bath of blood. Specifically, the blood of infants or virgins. It is the same logic as the Pope's transfusion, but external. The belief that pure blood could wash away the corruption of the skin. There are legends, and perhaps some truths, of desperate nobles bathing in blood. the sensory nightmare, the copper smell filling the room, the sticky cooling fluid, the guilt. It never worked. It just added murder to the misery. But if you couldn't get blood, you could get viper wine. Venomous snakes drowned in wine. The theory? Snakes shed their skin. They are creatures of renewal. Therefore drinking their essence will renew your skin. The apothecary would have a large jar on the counter. Inside, a tangle of dead adders floating in amber liquid. Their eyes cloudy, their mouths open. He ladles out a cup. To your health. You drink. It tastes of alcohol and reptile musk. A bitter, scaly taste. You're drinking a pickling solution for snakes, but let's leave the pharmacy and go to the barber's chair again. Because he has a new treatment for lunacy, the swing. If a patient was melancholic or manic, the doctor might prescribe spinning. They would tie the patient to a chair suspended from the ceiling by ropes, and they would spin it, fast, until the ropes were tight, then let it go. Whirr. The chair spins wildly, the patient vomits. They pass out from the G-force. The centrifugal force separates the humours, the doctor explains. The heavy black bile is flung out to the extremities. The sensory reality is vertigo, the world blurring, the nausea, the helplessness. You're being treated with a playground ride from hell, and if the spinning didn't work, the shock. They would suddenly throw the patient into a tub of ice water, or fire a cannon next to their ear. The goal was to reset the mind through terror. It was psychiatric care by jump scare. But there is one final treatment for this section. One that sounds almost pleasant. The tobacco enema. This is late 18th century but fits the boring history flow. When tobacco was discovered, Europeans thought it was a panacea. It warmed the body. It stimulated the heart. So, if someone drowned, they would blow tobacco smoke up their rectum. They had special bellows for it. The sensory reality. You are drowned. You are unconscious. You wake up because someone is pumping smoke into your colon. It worked. Sometimes. The nicotine is a stimulant. It jump-started the heart. But it is the ultimate indignity. To be saved by a smoke enema. And as you stand there, smelling the bone fire, tasting the fried mouse, feeling the dizziness of the swing, and watching the smoke bellows, you realise the human body is a mystery, and the medieval attempt to solve it was a comedy of errors written in blood. But the night is deep. The bone fire has burned down. You are alive. You have not been spun. You have not been smoked, mostly. Sleep now, because tomorrow we have to talk about the law and the trial by ordeal, where the judge is a red-hot iron bar. The sun has risen, but for you, the day is dark. You're standing in the nave of the church, but this is not a service. It is a trial. You have been accused. Maybe you stole a sheep. Maybe you cut down a tree in the king's forest. Maybe you just annoyed a neighbour who has a very loud voice. There are no lawyers here. There is no jury. There is no evidence folder. There is only the ordeal. The logic of medieval justice was simple. Humans are easily fooled, but God is not. Therefore we will torture you, and if God likes you, he will perform a miracle to stop the pain. Welcome to trial by iron. The sensory reality is the heat. In the centre of the church, a brazier is burning. Coals glow red and orange. Resting in the heart of the fire is a bar of iron, weighing 1 pound. The priest is chanting. He sprinkles holy water on the iron. Hiss. Steam rises, smelling of wet metal. You have to pick it up. You have to carry it 9 feet, and you have to drop it. You step forward. The heat radiates against your face, drying your eyes. You reach out. Your hand trembles. You grab the iron. The sensation is white noise. It is beyond pain. It is the smell of your own palm searing. You take 3 steps, 6 steps, 9 steps. You drop the bar. Clang. It hits the stone floor. But the trial isn't over. The priest bandages your hand with linen. He seals it with wax. You have to wait 3 days. The sensory experience of those 3 days is throbbing. You sit in your cell. Your hand is a pulse of agony. You cannot see the wound. You can only feel the heat of the infection battling the body. After 3 days, they cut the wax. They unwrap the bandage. If the wound is healing cleanly, you're innocent. God has intervened. If the wound is festering, infected, you're guilty. God has rejected you. And then they hang you. It was justice by biology. If you had a strong immune system, you were innocent. If you were malnourished and prone to infection, you were a criminal. But if you didn't like fire, you could choose water. Trial by cold water, usually reserved for serfs, or later for witches. The sensory reality is the rope. They tie your thumbs to your toes. You are a human ball. They row you out to the middle of the pond. The water is black, still and freezing. They throw you in. The shock of the cold. The water filling your nose. The silence of the deep. The logic. Water is a pure element. It is used in baptism. Therefore water will reject anything impure. If you float, the water has rejected you. You are guilty. And then they hang you. If you sink, the water has accepted you. You're innocent. And hopefully they pull you up before you drown. You're praying to sink. You're praying to be submerged in the freezing mud at the bottom of the pond. But sometimes the water wasn't cold. It was boiling. Trial by hot water. A cauldron. Boiling. Water. A stone at the bottom. You have to reach in and pull out the stone. The sensory detail is the steam. It scalds your face before your hand even touches the water. You plunge your arm in. The heat creates a glove of pain. You grope for the stone. It is slippery. You grab it. You pull it out. Again, they bandage the arm. Again, you wait 3 days. It was a system where the punishment happened before the verdict. But surely there was a trial that didn't involve maiming. The korsned, the trial by cake, or trial by bread and cheese. This was usually for the clergy, because priests didn't want to hold hot iron. The accused would stand at the altar. A piece of bread, or cheese, was blessed with a curse. May this bread choke me if I am lying. You have to eat it. It sounds easy. But fear dries the mouth. The sensory reality is the crumbs. You are terrified. Your mouth is like sand. You try to swallow the dry bread. It sticks to your throat. You gag. You cough. He chokes, the congregation shouts. Guilty! It was a primitive lie detector test based on the physiology of panic. Earl Godwin, the father of King Harold, famously died during a trial by cake. He choked, collapsed, and died. Or he had a stroke, but the bread got the credit. But if God wouldn't decide, maybe violence would. Trial by combat. The judicial duel. If you accused someone of a crime and there were no witnesses, you could challenge them to fight. But not a knightly duel with swords. This was legal combat. The weapons were regulated, cudgels, wooden shields, and if it was a man versus a woman, usually in cases of domestic dispute in Germanic law, the man was put in a hole waist deep. One hand was tied behind his back. He held a mace. The woman was free to move around the hole. She held a rock tied into a sleeve, a primitive flail, the sensory chaos. The man spinning in the hole trying to strike. The woman, dancing around the edge, swinging the rock. The crowd cheering. It wasn't a fight, it was a spectacle. And if you lost, you didn't just lose the case, you were executed immediately. Because if you lost, it meant you were lying, and perjury was a capital offence. But let's say you weren't executed. Let's say you were just imprisoned. Welcome to the oubliette, from the French oublier, to forget. This wasn't a cell. It was a bottle dungeon. A deep, narrow shaft dug into the floor of the castle. The only entrance was a trapdoor in the ceiling. The sensory reality is the drop. The guards open the hatch. You look down. It is pitch black. You smell the damp, the mould, and the waste of previous occupants. They push you. You fall. You hit the hard stone floor. You break a leg. The trapdoor slams shut. A single ray of light filters through a grate high above. You are forgotten. There is no door. There is no guard to bribe. Food is thrown down to you, sometimes. You sit in the dark, feeling the walls. They are smooth. You cannot climb. You're buried alive in stone. It was a storage closet for human beings the Lord didn't want to think about anymore. But if you were lucky, you went to a normal dungeon, which was just a wet basement. But the jail wasn't free. The jailer's fee. In the medieval world, prisons were private enterprises. The jailer paid the king for the right to run the jail. He made his profit from the prisoners. You had to pay for your ease. If you wanted a bed, you paid. If you wanted food, you paid. If you wanted the shackles taken off, suit of irons fee. The sensory experience is the clinking. You're wearing heavy iron fetters. They chafe your ankles. You can barely walk. The jailer rattles his keys. 2 pence for the light irons, he says. 4 pence to have them off. I have no money, you say. Then you wear the heavy irons, he says. He puts a collar on your neck. He chains you to the wall. Even when your sentence was over, you couldn't leave until you paid the discharge fee. There were men who were declared innocent by the court, but died in prison years later because they couldn't afford the fee to be released. It was a hotel where you couldn't check out. But let's leave the dungeon and go to the pillory again, but this time for a specific crime. Selling bad wine. The punishment was poetic. The vintner was put in the pillory, and the bad wine was poured over his head. The sensory reality. You are locked in the wood. You are sticky. The wine is sour, stinging your eyes, soaking your clothes. The wasps come. They are attracted to the sugar. You are a living lollipop for insects, or the scold's ducking stool. Another punishment for women who spoke too much. A chair tied to a seesaw on the riverbank. The woman was strapped in. The crowd cheered. Splash! She is dunked into the river. The water is cold, muddy, full of sewage. She comes up gasping. Splash! Down again. It was public torture disguised as community policing. But the most gruesome punishments were reserved for those who threatened the state. Hanged, drawn, and quartered. We won't dwell on the gore, but the sensory intent was the spectacle. It was designed to be seen, to be smelled, to be remembered. The traitor's head was dipped in tar to preserve it, and put on a spike on London Bridge. The sensory detail is the commute. You're walking into London, you look up. You see the row of heads. They are weathered, pecked by birds. The tar melts in the sun, dripping black tears. It is a billboard of state power. Do not rebel. And as you stand there, looking at the bridge, nursing your burned hand from the iron trial, shivering from the cold water trial, your stomach turning from the bread trial, you realise the law wasn't about justice. It was about order, and order was maintained by pain. But the night is ending. The ordeal is over. You survived the iron. You floated, or sank, whichever was good. You are free, but you have a headache, and the doctor is gone. So you go to the wise woman again. She gives you willow bark. You chew it. It tastes bitter. It is aspirin, salicylic acid. It works. For a moment the pain fades, and you sleep, because tomorrow we have to talk about the sumptuary laws again. But this time, it's about what you eat. Wait, we did that. Let's talk about the night soil men again? No, let's talk about the funeral. The sin-eater has eaten the bread. The soul scot has been paid. But what happens to the body? The ossuary? The bone house? The bone house? The charnel house? In the medieval city, real estate was expensive, even for the dead. The graveyards were small, they filled up. So after a few years, when the flesh was gone, the sexton would dig up the bones. He would clean them. He would stack them. Skulls in a row, femurs in a pile. The sensory reality of the ossuary is the dry rattle. You walk into the crypt. The walls are lined with thousands of bones. They are yellow, polished, anonymous. The smell is of dust and dry earth. It is a library of the dead. You look at the skulls. You wonder which one was the tax collector, which one was the king, which one was the peasant. They all look the same. In death, the sumptuary laws finally end. The window tax doesn't apply. The beard tax is irrelevant. You are just calcium. It is the only true equality the medieval world offered. But let's step out of the crypt and into the light, because there is one final absurdity we haven't covered. The window tax again? No. The stump tax? No. The tax on time. In Russia, under Peter the Great, the beard tax guy, workers were fined if they were late to the factory, but they didn't have clocks, so they listened for the factory whistle. But the whistle was blown by a man who was paid to save coal, so he blew it late, or early. The sensory frustration. You are running through the snow. You hear the whistle. It sounds like a scream. You arrive at the gate. It is closed. You are fined. You are paying for the flexibility of time itself. And as you stand there, in the snow, locked out of your own livelihood, you realize that the ultimate currency of history is patience. You have walked through the fire, the water, the tax office, the hospital, and the graveyard. You have survived. And now you can rest. The night is truly over. The sun is shining on the great bricks. The ancient lights are illuminating the dust. The system is still there. The bureaucracy is still humming. But for now, in this quiet moment before the world wakes up, you are free. The ledger is closed. Sleep well. good night, dust on your feet. It sounds poetic, a metaphor for travel and experience. But in the court of pie powder, it is a legal status. The name comes from the French pieds poudrés, dusty feet. This is the court of the marketplace, the court of the traveller, the court of the merchant who cannot wait for the slow, grinding gears of the royal justice system. The sensory reality of the pie powder court is noise. It is held right there in the market square, perhaps under a temporary canvas awning that flaps in the wind, or in a toll booth smelling of wet wood and old coins. The judge sits on a barrel or a rough bench. He shouts over the bleating of sheep, the crying of hawkers, and the clatter of cartwheels. You are there because you have been accused of forestalling. This is the crime of buying goods before they reach the market. You met a farmer on the road. You bought his eggs cheaper than the market price. You thought you were being smart. You thought you were getting a deal. But the town council calls it theft. You stole the toll they would have collected if the farmer had entered the gate. You stole the stolage fee. The justice here is fast, brutally fast. The judge looks at your dusty boots. He looks at the eggs hidden under your cloak. Guilty, he barks. Fined. You pay immediately. If you can't pay, they seize the eggs, and your cloak, and maybe your boots. It is justice as a transaction. Quick, dirty, and designed to ensure that no transaction happens without the lord getting his cut. But if you weren't buying eggs, maybe you were selling wool. Enter the tronager. In the centre of the market stands the tron. It is a massive, intimidating wooden beam scale, suspended from a gallows-like frame. It looks like an instrument of torture, and for your wallet it is. The tron is the only legal way to weigh wool in the town. You cannot use your own scales. You must use the lord's tron. The sensory detail is the heave. You lift your heavy sack of wool, greasy, smelling of lanolin and sheep sweat, onto the hook. The rope creaks. The beam groans. The tronager is the official weigher. He's a man who takes his time. He watches the needle quiver. He adds a weight. He removes a weight. Heavy sack, he says, eyeing you. He charges you tronage, a tax for the act of weighing. But here is the cynical twist. The weights are often the king's weights, and the king's pound might be heavier than your pound. You watch as your profits vanish into the discrepancy of the scale. You are paying a tax on gravity itself, and if you thought the tronager was bad, wait until the clerk of the market arrives. This was a royal official who travelled with the king's court. When the king came to town, the clerk came with him, and the clerk had ambit. His jurisdiction extended for 12 miles around the king's person. Suddenly, every local measure was suspect. The sensory experience of the clerk's visit is panic. The rumour spreads through the stalls like wildfire. The clerk is coming! You hide your bushel baskets, you hide your yardsticks, you hide your pint pots. Why? Because if your pint pot is a fraction of an inch too small, dented by years of use in the tavern, the clerk will smash it. He will fine you. He brings the royal standard, a bronze pot that is physically perfect. He pours water from his pot to yours. If yours overflows, fine. If yours isn't full, fine. The market becomes a scene of frantic calibration. Prices go up to cover the bribes you will have to pay him to look the other way. The king's presence isn't a celebration. It is an economic, natural disaster. But let's leave the market square and retreat to the tavern. Surely there you can relax. Not if it is the season of the banvan. This was a feudal right found across France and parts of England. It wasn't a tax on wine. It was a monopoly on time. When the new wine was pressed, or the new ale brewed, the lord declared the banvan. For a period of 30 or 40 days, only the lord was allowed to sell wine. Every tavern keeper had to close their taps. Every peasant with a surplus barrel had to wait. The sensory reality is the stale cup. You walk into the village tavern, you know that your neighbour, Jacques, has just pressed a beautiful vintage. It is fresh, fruity, light. You can smell the fermentation from his barn. But the tavern keeper cannot serve it. He has to serve the lord's wine, and the lord's wine is suspicious. It is often the dregs from last year. It is turning to vinegar. It is cloudy with sediment. But you have to drink it, and you have to pay premium prices for it. The lord is clearing out his cellar at your expense. He's forcing you to consume his bad inventory before you're allowed to taste your own good labour. It is a tax on your palate, a state-mandated hangover. And speaking of wine, the banality of the press completes the nightmare. If you grew grapes, you couldn't crush them with your feet in a bucket. That was concealed production. You had to use the Lord's wine press. The sensory experience is the sticky floor. You carry your baskets of grapes up the hill to the Lord's barn. The juice is leaking, purple and sweet, staining your clothes, attracting wasps. The air is thick with the buzzing of insects and the heavy yeasty smell of the must. You dump your grapes into the massive wooden press. The screw turns, creak, groan. The juice flows out into the Lord's vat. The pressman takes his cut, and he takes the mark, the leftover skins and seeds. From the mark he makes piquette, a weak watery drink for the servants. He squeezes value out of the garbage. You walk home with your reduced juice, your sticky hands, and the knowledge that the Lord has profited from the very sunlight that ripened your fruit. But the Lord didn't just control the liquids, he controlled the birds. We must talk about the dovecote, the pigeon tower. In medieval Europe, keeping pigeons was a privilege restricted to the nobility. You stand in your field. You have just sown your grain. The earth is fresh, dark, hopeful. Then you hear it. A low rhythmic thrumming. A cloud of grey wings descends from the Lord's tower. Hundreds of pigeons. They land on your field. They eat your seeds. You grab a stone to throw at them. You stop. Killing a Lord's pigeon is a crime. You're legally required to stand there and watch the Lord's pets eat your children's dinner. It was a tax levied by beak and claw, and as the birds rise, full of your grain, flying back to the stone tower to become squab. For the Lord's table, you realise that the ecosystem itself has been rigged against you. But the sun is setting, the market is closed, the pigeons are roosting. You head home. You have paid the tronager, you have paid the banvin, you have paid the pie powder fine, you're tired. But the night brings its own costs, because tomorrow the saltpeter men are rumoured to be in the next village, and they are looking for dirt. The saltpeter men. They do not knock. They do not ask for permission. They have a royal warrant, a piece of parchment that gives them more authority over your home than you have. Gunpowder has changed the world. It has made castles obsolete and knights vulnerable. But gunpowder requires saltpeter, potassium nitrate. And in the medieval and early modern world, saltpeter is not mined from the ground in some distant colony. It is harvested from the ground under your feet. Specifically, soil that has been soaked in organic waste. Urine, manure, decomposition. The best source? The dirt floor of a peasant's cottage, a stable, or a dovecote. The sensory reality of a visit from the saltpeter men is a violation. You're sitting at your table, perhaps mending a tool. The door bursts open. 3 men enter carrying shovels, pickaxes and baskets. They smell of earth and chemicals. The king needs his niter, the captain says. They start digging, right in your living room. They pry up the hard-packed earth floor that your family has walked on for generations. The smell hits you instantly. A sharp, acrid scent of ammonia and old decay released from the soil. Dust fills the air, coating your food, your hair, your lungs. They dig a pit 3 feet deep. They test the soil, and this is the part that makes you shudder. The saltpeter taster takes a pinch of the dirt from under your bed and puts it on his tongue. He's tasting for the sharp, salty tang of nitrate. Good soil, he grunts. Rich. They shovel your floor into their carts. They leave you with a crater. They do not pay you for the dirt. They do not fix the floor. They simply leave, taking the very foundation of your house to be turned into an explosion on a battlefield in France. You're left standing on the edge of a hole in your own home, feeling the cold draft rising from the earth, realizing that the king's war has literally undermined your existence. But if the king could claim the dirt inside your house, he could certainly claim the people who didn't quite belong. The alien subsidy. In the medieval world, alien didn't mean a creature from the stars. It meant a foreigner, and a foreigner could be someone from a different country, or sometimes just someone from a different county. If you were a Flemish weaver, a French wine merchant, or an Italian banker living in London or York, you were an alien, and you paid for it. The sensory experience of the alien subsidy is the poll, the head count. You are standing in line at the Guildhall. The air is tense. The local craftsmen look at you with suspicion. They claim you are stealing their work. The king claims you are a security risk. Both agree you should pay double. The tax collector looks at your papers. He listens to your accent. Double rate, he says, stamping your document. You pay. You pay for the right to work. You pay for the right to breathe English air. You are a guest, A, who's being charged rent for the hallway. It creates a sense of permanent insecurity. You can never truly settle. You're always one tax hike away from exile. But let's leave the city and go back to the wild borderlands. The north, the Cornage, also known as Horngeld. In the lands bordering Scotland, the threat of invasion was constant. To pay for defence, the lords levied a tax on cattle, but not by the head, by the horn. The logic was that horns were dangerous, or perhaps that a cow with horns was a mature asset. The sensory reality is the saw. Farmers, desperate to avoid the tax, would sometimes dehorn their cattle. Imagine the barn in winter. The cow is tied up. The farmer holds a saw. The sound of metal grinding against bone, the animal bellowing in fear. The smell of bone dust, chalky and burnt, filling the air. You're mutilating your livestock to save a few pennies. The cows look strange now, defenceless, but they are tax efficient. It is a perfect example of how tax policy shapes the physical world. The landscape changes, the animals change, all to fit the ledger. But sometimes the tax wasn't on the animal, it was on the animal's movement, the drift of the forest. This sounds poetic, like leaves blowing in the wind. In reality, it was a cattle drive audit. Once a year, the agistas, forest officials, would drive all the animals out of the forest and into a corral. They wanted to count them. They wanted to see whose cows were eating the king's grass. If your cow was found in the forest without a brand or a paid fee, confiscated. The sensory experience is the roundup. The sound of horns blowing, the shouting of men on horseback, the panic of the animals. You're running to the corral trying to find your cow in the swirling dust and noise. You have to prove she is yours. You have to show the receipt for the pannage or the herbage. If you lost the slip of parchment, you lost the cow. It was a chaotic audit of nature. But the most bizarre tax on the natural world was one that targeted the very coastline, the wreck of the sea. We touched on this, but the royal fish aspect deserves a closer look. If a whale washed up, it was the king's. If a sturgeon was caught, it was the king's. But what about a porpoise or a swan? The king's menu was extensive. Imagine you are a fisherman. You have caught a sturgeon, a massive prehistoric-looking fish with armoured plates. It is worth a fortune, but you cannot sell it. You have to offer it to the king. You have to pack it in straw. You have to hire a cart. You have to transport it to the palace. By the time you get there, the fish smells. The king's steward looks at it, wrinkles his nose and says, "We accept the tribute." He doesn't pay you, he gives you a nod. You have spent a week's wages transporting a fish you weren't allowed to eat, to a man who probably won't eat it, either. It is a tax paid in effort and rot. But let's end this section with a tax that hits you right in the vanity. The hair powder tax. In 1795, the British government decided that vanity was a taxable asset. Hair powder, made of starch and perfume, was essential for the upper classes and their servants to maintain the white-wigged look. The tax was 1 guinea per year, a huge sum. The result? The guinea pigtail. Only the rich could afford to keep wearing their hair powdered and tied back. The poor, and the thrifty rich, stopped powdering. They cut their hair short. The crop haircut became fashionable, not because it looked better, but because it was tax-free. The sensory change in society was visual and olfactory. The courts became darker as the white wigs vanished. The smell of lavender and starch faded, replaced by the smell of, well, just hair. The tax code literally changed the hairstyle of a nation. It killed the wig industry, overnight. And as you stand there, rubbing the bone dust off your hands from the cornage, smelling the saltpeter from your ruined floor, looking at your unpowdered hair in a reflection, you realise the state shapes you. It shapes your house. It shapes your animals. It shapes your head. But the night is deep. The saltpeter men have gone to the next village. The agistas are asleep. You lie down on your mattress, stuffed with fresh straw, hopefully. You pull the blanket up. You have survived the invasion of your floor, but tomorrow is Sunday, and that means church. And in the medieval church, even the pew has a price. The church bell tolls, a heavy reverberating sound that calls you from the fields or your workshop. It is Sunday, the day of rest, or so you're told. But as you approach the heavy oak doors of the parish church, you know that rest comes with a price tag. Welcome to the pew rent. For centuries the nave of the church, the main body, where the congregation stood, was an open space. People milled about, knelt on the flagstones, or brought their own three-legged stools. It was communal. It was equal. But then the church wardens realised that comfort was a commodity. They installed wooden boxes, pews, high-sided with doors that locked, and they rented them out. The sensory reality of the pew rent is the hierarchy of warmth. You walk into the church. The air is cold, smelling of stone dust and old incense. At the front near the altar, where the heat from the candles gathers, are the box pews. They are lined with green baize or red velvet. They have cushions stuffed with wool. The local lord sits there, invisible behind the high wooden walls, warm, comfortable, private. You're in the free seats at the back, hard, narrow benches with no backs, polished smooth by the shifting of thousands of uncomfortable bodies. Or worse, you're standing. The cold seeps up through the soles of your boots. Your legs ache. You can barely see the priest over the walls of the rich men's boxes. You're witnessing the monetization of salvation. The closer you sit to God, the more it costs. The church has turned the congregation into a tiered seating plan. But if you tried to bring your own stool, the verger would stop you, or charge you a stool fee. And while you stood there freezing, listening to the Latin you didn't understand, you might hear a sudden commotion. A dog barking. A stray dog has wandered in, looking for warmth or a crumb of the communion bread. Enter the dog whipper. This was an actual paid job title in the parish accounts. The dog whipper. His job was to run around the church during the service with a long whip and a pair of wooden tongs chasing out dogs. The sensory chaos is almost funny. The priest is trying to chant the Mass. Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanctus. Crack, the sound of the whip. Yelp, the sound of the dog. Clatter, the sound of the dog whipper tripping over a pew. It turns the holy service into a slapstick comedy. But it also highlights a truth. The church was a public space, the only public space, and keeping the chaos of nature out of the order of God required a man with a whip. And sometimes, the dog whipper had another job. Sluggard waker. He carried a long stick. On one end, a hard wooden knob, on the other, a foxtail. If a man fell asleep during the sermon, thwack, the wooden knob on the head. If a woman fell asleep, tickle, the foxtail on the face. It was a tax on tiredness. You were legally required to attend church. The recusancy fine taxed you if you didn't go, and you were physically punished if you didn't pay attention. You were a captive audience in the most literal sense. But the church didn't just tax your presence, it taxed your absence, and your sins. The summoner returns. We mentioned him before, but his role in the archdeacon's court deserves a closer look. This court dealt with moral crimes, adultery, fornication, gluttony, working on a feast day. The summoner was the man who delivered the bad news. He was often a blackmailer. He would find out your secrets and offer to lose the paperwork for a bribe. The sensory experience of the archdeacon's court is shame. You stand in the centre of the room. The archdeacon sits on a raised dais. Your neighbours are watching. You have to confess your sins out loud. I ploughed my field on St. Swithin's Day. 3 shillings fine, the archdeacon says, or 3 whips around the market cross. You pay the money to avoid the whip. It was a system that turned sin into revenue. The more you sinned, the richer the church got, which created a perverse incentive for the church to find sin everywhere. But the most cynical religious tax wasn't on the living, it was on the dead, the mortuary, again, and the sole Scot. But let's look at the Burial in Woolen Act, again because the enforcement was sensory. 2 witnesses had to swear an affidavit that the deceased was buried in wool. If they lied, fined. So the family had to invite the neighbours to inspect the corpse in the coffin. Imagine the scene, the wake. The body is laid out, the neighbours file past, they touch the shroud. Is it wool? The official asks. It feels like wool, the neighbour says. You are inviting the taxman into your grief. You are turning your final goodbye into a compliance check. But let's leave the churchyard and go back to the river. Because the king isn't done with the water, the right of the ferry. We talked about the ferry monopoly. But what if there was no ferry? What if you built your own bridge? The pontage. If you built a bridge to help your neighbours, the king could seize it, or demand a licence fee, or demand a cut of any toll you charged. But the real absurdity was the bridge hermit. Often bridges were maintained by hermits, men who lived in small cells built into the bridge structure. They collected tolls in exchange for prayers for the traveller's safety. The sensory reality. You cross the bridge. A hairy hand reaches out from a stone window. "A penny for a prayer," a voice croaks. You pay. You aren't paying for the road. You're paying for spiritual insurance against falling off. It was a gig economy for holy men. But let's end this section with the most pervasive, inescapable tax of all, the one that taxed the very light of the moon. Wait, we did the lantern. What about the street cleaning, the scavenger's rate? Originally, householders had to clean the street in front of their own house. Every man sweep his own door, but then the city hired scavengers and charged you a rate. The sensory experience is the muckraker. The scavenger comes with his cart. He shovels the horse manure, the mud, the garbage. The smell is thick and choking. You pay him, but if you don't, he leaves the pile in front of your door. It was a protection racket. Nice door you have there. Shame if a pile of dung appeared in front of it. And as you stand there smelling the street, rubbing the bruise from the sluggard waker, clutching your wool shroud receipt, and watching the bridge hermit count his pennies, you realise the medieval world was a place where every interaction, spiritual, physical or commercial, had a transaction fee attached. But the sun is setting. The curfew bell is ringing. You hurry home. You bank your fire. You blow out your rushlight. You're safe in the dark until tomorrow, when the window peeper comes back. Sleep well. The dawn is breaking, but the silence of the morning is broken by a squawk, a loud, indignant, feathered protest. You are holding a chicken. It is Christmas morning. In the modern world, this is a time of receiving. In the medieval world, it is a time of paying. Welcome to the chicken rent. Many feudal tenures required the payment of 1 hen at Christmas and 10 eggs at Easter. It sounds quaint, a barter system. But the logistics were a nightmare of poultry management. The sensory reality is the carry. You have to walk to the manor house. It is freezing. The snow is crunching under your boots. You're holding a live hen under your arm. The bird is warm, smelling of dust and feathers. It pecks at your sleeve. It struggles. It defecates on your coat. You arrive at the Lord's kitchen. There is a line of peasants, all holding chickens. The air is filled with clucking and the smell of wet wool. The steward checks your bird. "Too skinny," he says. The Lord likes fat hens. He rejects your rent. You have to go back and find another chicken, or pay a fine. You're being judged by the nutritional value of your livestock. But if the chicken was a burden, the rabbit was a temptation, the free warren. In the Middle Ages, rabbits, called conies, were not wild pests. They were luxury items introduced by the Normans, kept in artificial mounds called warreners. They were soft, furry and delicious, and they were strictly for the Lord. The warrener was the official who guarded them. He lived in a stone tower in the middle of the rabbit field. He was armed. The sensory experience of the warren is the twitch. You are walking past the mound. You see the rabbits playing in the twilight. They are grey-brown, quick, alive. You are hungry. A rabbit stew would feed your family for 2 days, but you cannot touch them. The penalties for poaching a coney were severe: fines, imprisonment. Abjuration of the realm. You are starving in a landscape that is teeming with meat you are legally forbidden to eat. The rabbit is a furry symbol of your class status, but sometimes the animal wasn't in a warren. It was loose, the stray. If a cow, horse or sheep wandered onto the Lord's land and no one claimed it, it was impounded. The sensory reality is the pound, a stone-walled enclosure in the village centre. The stray animal stands there, looking miserable. It lows in the rain. If the owner doesn't claim it within a year and a day, the animal belongs to the Lord. But to claim it, you had to pay for its food and water for the time it was in the pound. Often the cost of the food was more than the value of the cow. So you watch your own cow standing in the pound. You can see it. You can hear it, but you can't afford to rescue it. You watch your property slowly become the Lord's property, day by expensive day. It was a slow-motion confiscation. But if the Lord claimed the stray animals, the king claimed the stolen goods. The waif. This is a specific legal term. If a thief stole something, say, a bag of silver, and was chased by the hue and cry, he might drop the bag to run faster. The bag is found in the road. Who does it belong to? The victim? No. It is waif. It belongs to the king. The logic. The thief waived. Abandoned it. Therefore it is ownerless. Therefore it is the king's. The sensory horror. You are the victim. You chase the thief. You see him drop your grandmother's silver cup. You run to pick it up. The sheriff steps on it. Waif, he says. You have been robbed twice, once by the criminal and once by the law. It creates a world where justice is a revenue stream, and the victim is just another source of income. But let's move from the road to the bridge again, because the Pontage bridge toll has a nasty cousin, the ferryman's right. In some places, if a bridge washed away, the ferryman had the monopoly. But the ferryman was often a serf who leased the right from the lord. He had to pay a huge fee, so he charged you, even if the river was shallow enough to wade. The sensory detail is the wet boot. You try to wade across the ford to save a penny. The water is cold, swirling around your calves. The riverbed is slippery stones. The ferryman sees you. He shouts, "That is the Lord's water," he wades out. He hits you with his oar. He fines you for subverting the passage. You're paying for the water you didn't want to be in. But the most oppressive taxes were the ones that targeted your labour directly. The chevage. This was a head money paid by serfs who lived outside the manor. If you wanted to leave the village and work in a town, you had to pay the lord an annual fee for the permission to not live there. It was a tax on freedom of movement, a subscription fee for your own autonomy. The sensory reality is the return. Once a year, you have to walk back to the village you escaped. You're wearing better clothes now. You're a craftsman. But you have to stand before the bailiff, take off your hat and hand him a coin. "I am still your man," you say. It is a ritual of humiliation, a reminder that no matter how far you go, you are still tethered to the dirt where you were born. But surely the king couldn't tax your defence? The mirage. We mentioned this before, the tax to build walls. But let's look at the Barbican, the fortified gatehouse. Merchants entering the city often had to pay extra to pass through the Barbican. Why? Because the gate was complex. It had a drawbridge, a portcullis, murder holes. The sensory experience is the shadow of the gate. You drive your cart under the massive stone arch. It is dark, cool, echoing. You look up. You see the holes in the ceiling where they could pour boiling oil on you. The guard stops you. "Barbican fee," he says. "You are paying for the architecture of fear. You're funding the very walls that trap you inside. But if the walls were expensive, the streets were dangerous. The hue and cry, fine. If you saw a crime, you were legally required to shout, 'Stop thief! Wolf! Fire!' If you didn't shout, fined. But if you shouted falsely, fined. The sensory reality is the hesitation. You see a shadow moving behind a barn. Is it a thief? Or just a lover sneaking out? If you scream and it's nothing, you pay. If you stay silent and it's a thief, you pay. You stand there in the dark, mouth half open, paralysed by the financial risk of making a noise. It was a tax on civic responsibility. And as the sun sets on the warren, the pound, the bridge and the wall, you realise that the medieval world was a maze of financial tripwires. But the night is not over. There is one final absurdity. The marl, a type of clay used as fertiliser. If you wanted to dig marl on, your own land to improve your own soil. You had to pay the lord for breaking the earth. You paid a tax to improve the yield of the crops that you would then pay a tithe on. It was a tax on trying to make things better. And as you lie in your bed, listening to the wind in the Lord's trees, smelling the Lord's smoke, digesting the Lord's bad bread, you close your eyes. You dream of a world where the only thing you owe is kindness. But kindness isn't a legal tender. And tomorrow, the ale conner is coming back, and he is wearing leather breeches. The ale conner has come and gone, leaving a wet stain on your bench and a lighter purse in your pocket. The sun is high now, casting short, sharp shadows that cost nothing. Yet. You decide to escape the village. You need to breathe air that doesn't smell of regulation. You head to the coast, the sea. Vast, open, untamable. Surely here, on the edge of the world, you're free. Welcome to the right of foreshore. In England, the land between the high water mark and the low water mark belonged to the Crown. This sounds like a legal technicality, but to a coastal peasant, it was a daily battle with the tide. Imagine the sensory reality. You are gathering samphire, a salty edible sea vegetable, or perhaps digging for cockles in the mud. The tide is out. The mud is glistening, wet, smelling of ozone and salt. You're standing on the king's mud. If you find a piece of driftwood, the king's wood. If you find a piece of amber, the king's jewel. If you set up a fish trap, you're building on the king's land. The Admiralty Court patrolled the coastline. They didn't care about the beauty of the waves. They cared about the jurisdiction of the sand. You are walking on a border that moves with the moon. Twice a day the land becomes the sea. Twice a day the king's property vanishes under the waves and then reappears, demanding tribute. It was a tax on the tides. But if the coast was owned, surely the open ocean was free. The Cinque Ports. 5 ports in southeast England, Hastings, New Romney, Hythe, Dover, Sandwich, were given special privileges, tax exemptions, in exchange for providing ships. But this created a monopoly. If you were a fisherman from a non-Cinque port, you were harassed, you were taxed, you were boarded. The sensory experience is the rivalry. You're in your small boat. You smell the tar and the fish. You see a ship from Dover approaching. It is larger, faster. The sailors shout at you. They demand a passage fee. You're paying a toll on the open water, enforced by your own countrymen, but let's leave the salt spray and go back inland. To the most precious resource of all, iron. The forge tax. Blacksmiths were the engineers of the village. They made the ploughs, the horseshoes, the nails, but they used fire, and they used iron. The Lord taxed the forge. The sensory. Detail is the heat. The forge is a dark, glowing cave. The bellows wheeze like a dying giant. The hammer rings. Clang, clang, clang. The smell of hot iron is metallic and biting. The smith works hard. His arms are massive, but he is angry. Every third horseshoe for the Lord, he mutters. He's paying a tax in curved metal. And if you needed a nail, you paid the smith, who paid the Lord. The price of holding your house together was inflated by feudal rent. But the Lord didn't just own the metal. He owned the very concept of measurement, the olnage. We mentioned this with cloth, but it applied to liquids too. The gauger. This was the official who measured barrels of wine and oil. He carried a gauge, a rod. He would plunge it into the bunghole of the barrel to check the volume. But if the barrel wasn't a standard size, he would stave it, smash it open. The sensory horror. You're a merchant. You have hauled a barrel of wine from Bordeaux. It smells rich, fruity, promising. The gauger measures it. Non-standard, he says. He takes a hammer. Crash. The wood splinters. The wine gushes out onto the cobblestones, a red river of wasted profit. The smell of alcohol fills the street. You watch your livelihood soak into the dirt. It was a tax on standardization, a brutal enforcement of geometry. But let's look at something more personal. The clothes on your back. The livery. This wasn't a tax you paid, it was a tax paid to wear you. Rich lords would dress their servants in matching clothes. Livery. Blue coats with yellow badges, red coats with white swans. It was a status symbol. Look how many men I own. But the king saw this as a threat. A lord with too many liveried men had a private army. So the king passed the Statute of Livery. He taxed the lord for every man he dressed. The sensory result, the unbadging. The lord fires his servants, or he stops giving them clothes. You are a servant. You used to get a warm wool coat every winter. Now the lord says, too expensive. You are shivering in your old threadbare tunic. You have lost your warmth because the king was afraid of your master's vanity. It was a tax on employment. But the most invasive tax on the body was the poll tax on women. Specifically, in some iterations, women were taxed at a lower rate, but they were still taxed. And to prove you were a woman, and thus owed less, or a girl, and owed nothing, you had to be viewed. The sensory reality is the gaze. The tax collector looks at your daughter. She is tall. She is developing. She is a woman, he says, 4 pence. She is 12, you cry. She looks 15, he says. He is pricing her maturity. He is monetizing her puberty. It was a tax on growing up. And as you stand there, shielding your daughter from the collector's eyes, smelling the spilled wine from the smashed barrel, hearing the hammer of the taxed forge, you realize the medieval world was a place where nothing was private. Not your age, not your income, not your body, but the sun is setting. The curfew bell rings again. You go inside. You close the door, narrow to avoid the door tax. You sit in the dark. You have survived another day of being counted, measured, weighed, and found taxable. But tomorrow is market day, and the pie powder court is waiting. The market is opening. The wooden shutters of the stalls are banging open, a rhythmic clatter that sounds like applause for the rising sun. You're walking through the crowd, careful to keep your hand on your purse, but you stop. A man is sitting in the mud. He holds out a hand. He is a beggar, but he is wearing a badge, a heavy pewter plate strapped to his chest, stamped with the seal of the town. Welcome to the beggar's license. In the medieval and Tudor world, even poverty was regulated. The authorities, terrified of sturdy beggars, people who could work but chose not to, created a system. If you were old, sick, or disabled, you were allowed to beg, but you had to buy the license. The sensory absurdity is crushing. You are destitute, you have nothing. But to ask for charity, you first have to scrape together a fee to the magistrate. The badge is heavy. It is cold against the skin. It clinks against the begging bowl. It is a government permit to be miserable. If you begged without a badge, you were whipped through the town until you reached the parish boundary. The sound of the whip, the sight of the V for vagabond branded into the chest with a hot iron. It was a tax on desperation, a way for the state to curate the aesthetics of poverty. But if the beggar was regulated, the thief was profitable. The right of gallows. This was a feudal privilege. A high lord didn't just have the right to hold a court, he had the right to hang people. Having a gallows on your land was a status symbol. It said, I have the power of life and death. But it was also a revenue stream. The lord confiscated the felon's goods, the chattels. The sensory reality is the creek. You are walking home at dusk. You pass the crossroads. There, silhouetted against the purple sky, is the gibbet. A wooden structure, black with tar. A body hangs there. It is encased in an iron cage to keep it from falling apart. The wind blows, the cage swings, creak, squeak. The smell of tar and decay drifts across the field. To you, it is a horror. To the Lord, it is an asset. The gallows is a machine that converts criminals into property. But the Lord didn't just take the criminal's property. He took yours too if the king came to visit. The purveyance. This was the king's right to buy goods for his household at a price he decided. The king's takers would ride into a village. They would look at your cart full of hay, or your barrel of ale, or your ox. The king needs this, the taker says. He marks your door with chalk. He takes the goods. He gives you a tally stick, a wooden IOU, or a wardrobe debenture. He pays you half the market rate. Or sometimes nothing at all, just a promise to pay later. They rarely paid later. The sensory experience is the chalk mark. You come home. You see the white cross scrawled on your barn door. It looks like a plague mark, but it is worse. It means the king is coming to eat your winter supplies. You watch your cart being driven away by a stranger wearing the royal livery. You have been robbed by the law. It was a tax disguised as a purchase. But let's move from the farm to the forest again. To the bees. We talked about the honey tax. But what about the wild bees? The bee bowl? If you found a swarm of bees in the woods, you couldn't just keep them. They belonged to the lord of the manor, right of free warren extended to insects. But if the bees swarmed from your hive onto his land, you had to chase them, and you had to make noise. The law stated that to claim a swarm you had to follow it tinging a pan, banging a metal pot. Why? To prove to the neighbours that you were chasing your bees, not stealing the Lord's bees. The sensory reality is the chase. You're running through the briars, scratching your face. You're banging a ladle against a cauldron. Clang, clang. The bees are a dark, buzzing cloud moving fast. You look ridiculous, you sound ridiculous. But you are performing a legal ritual of ownership. If you stopped banging, the bees became waif, ownerless, and the Lord took them. It was a tax on silence. You had to be loud to keep your property. But let's look at a tax that was silent, invisible, and deadly. The saltpeter again. But the urine aspect. In 1626, King Charles of the Run commanded that all his subjects collect their urine. The king's piss. You were not allowed to pave the floor of your stable. You had to keep it dirt. Why? So the urine from the horses would soak into the earth and create saltpeter. You were legally forbidden from having a clean floor. The sensory experience of the stable is the stench. The ammonia is overpowering. Your eyes water when you tend the horses. The mud is deep, foul, chemical, but you cannot clean it. The saltpeter man is coming to taste the dirt. You are living in a chemical factory for the state. But surely they couldn't tax the very words you spoke. The slander fine. In the manorial courts, you could be fined for fighting with words. If you called the bailiff a false thief, fine. If you called the miller a pollen thumb, fine. The court records are full of these insults. The sensory reality is the bitten tongue. You are angry. The miller has cheated you. You want to scream. You want to tell the truth. But you swallow the words. They taste bitter. You smile. Good day, miller. You pay a tax of silence to avoid the fine. And as you walk away seething, listening to the creak of the gibbet, smelling the ammonia of the stable, watching the beggar with his pewter badge, you realise the medieval world was a place where every natural impulse to speak, to clean, to keep what you grew was intercepted by a fee. But the night is coming. The curfew will ring soon, and tonight there is a wake. Neighbour has died, and the corpse road is waiting. But before you go, you have to pay the bell ringer, the passing bell. The bell tolls, bong, bong. It is not the call to prayer, it is the passing bell. When a person died in a medieval parish, the bell was rung to tell the community to pray for the departing soul. It sounded solemn, it sounded respectful, but it wasn't free. The sexton charged for the ringing, and he charged by the hour, or by the size of the bell. If you were rich, you got the great bell, deep, resonant, booming across the valley for hours, announcing your importance to God and the neighbours. If you were poor, you got the little bell, a tinny cracked sound that barely reached the end of the churchyard. Or you got silence. The sensory reality is the silence of the poor. Your father has died. You want the village to know. You want the prayers, but you count your pennies. You can't afford the toll. He passes in silence. His death is unannounced, unmarked by the soundscape of the parish. It was a tax on acoustic memory. But if the bell was expensive, the ground was extortionate. The lair silver. This was the fee for breaking the ground in the churchyard. The earth was consecrated. It was holy. Therefore digging a hole in it was a privilege. The sensory experience is the spade. You watch the gravedigger. He is a strong man, smelling of wet clay and ale. He spits on his hands. He drives the spade into the turf. Every foot of depth costs money. Deep grave? He asks. 2 shillings. Shallow grave? 6pence. You choose the shallow grave. You worry about the foxes. You worry about the smell in summer. But you have no choice. You're budgeting your own father's decomposition. But the church didn't just take money at the funeral. They took it at the party afterwards. The church ale. The church needed money for repairs, for bells, for candles. Did the bishop send gold? No. The church wardens brewed ale. Strong, heavy ale. And they held a church ale. It was a mandatory festival. You were expected to attend. You were expected to drink. And you were expected to pay well above the market rate. The sensory reality is the forced mirth. You're in the church house, or sometimes the nave itself. The air is hot, smelling of malt and sweat. The music is loud. You're not thirsty. You're tired, but the warden is watching. "Drink up, Thomas," he shouts, "for the roof." You drink. You pay. You get drunk because it is your civic duty. You wake up the next morning with a headache that feels like a penance. It was a bake sale, but with alcohol and social pressure. But let's leave the village and go to the high road. To the barriers. In France, this was the pige, a toll for using a road. But sometimes the road wasn't even a road. The river towpath. If you were towing a barge up the river, using a horse or men walking on the bank, you had to pay the landowner for walking on his grass, the hallage. The sensory detail is the rope. You are the towman. You have a heavy hemp rope across your chest. It burns your skin. You are leaning forward, pulling a boat against the current. Your boots slip in the mud. The bailiff stands on the bank. "Hallage," he says. You're a human engine, sweating, straining, and paying for the friction of your own feet. But surely the king couldn't tax the very act of commerce, of making a deal, the luck penny, or God's penny. When a bargain was struck at a market, say selling a cow, a small coin was given to seal the deal. Originally this was given to the church, God's penny, or spent on a drink, luck penny. But in some towns the official broker claimed it. Handshake tax. The sensory reality is the grip. You shake hands with the buyer. His hand is rough, warm. the deal is done, but you have to drop a coin into the broker's palm before you can let go. It monetized the moment of agreement. But the most bizarre tax on interaction was the glove money. In the Middle Ages, gloves were symbols of good faith, but they became bribes. If you wanted a judge to hear your case, you gave him a pair of gloves, but the gloves had to be lined with gold coins. The sensory experience is the heavy glove. You hand the velvet gloves to the magistrate. They are suspiciously heavy. They clink when he takes them. He smiles. The gloves fit, he says. You have bought justice disguised as an accessory. And as you stand there, listening to the passing bell toll for the rich man, smelling the church ale on your breath, feeling the rope burn on your chest and watching the judge put on his golden gloves, you realise the medieval world was a place where everything was for sale, but the price list was hidden. But the night is coming, and the curfew is ringing again. You head home. You pass the pinfold, where the stray animals are locked up. You pass the stocks, where the poor are locked up. You enter your house. You close the door. You are safe. Unless you have a hearth. Wait. The chimney man again. No. Tonight it is the saltpeter man's cousin, the searcher of the dead. During plague times, old women were paid to examine corpses to see if they died of the plague. The sensory horror. The knock at the door. Bring out your dead. The searcher enters. She smells of vinegar and gin. She touches the body. She looks for the spots. If she finds them, she locks you in. You pray she's drunk. You pray she's blind. You offer her a coin. Glove money. She takes it. He died of a fever, she says. You have bribed death's accountant. And as she leaves, and the silence returns, you realise that corruption is the only mercy left. Sleep now. Tomorrow, the window tax might be repealed. It won't be, but you can dream. The sun is up, shining on the wet slate roofs of the town. You have survived the night of the searcher, and the air feels cleaner, scrubbed by the morning breeze coming off the sea. You decide to walk to the coast. The ocean, surely, is the one place where the king's ledger cannot reach. You walk along the shoreline, the tide is out, the beach is a tangle of rocks and wet sand, and there, piled high in drifting mounds, is kelp, seaweed. In the medieval and early modern world, this slimy, foul-smelling vegetation was black gold. It was burned to create soda ash, used for making glass and soap. You see a peasant gathering it. He's bent double, his hands red and raw from the cold water and the iodine. He's dragging heavy, wet strands of oarweed onto the beach. The smell is overpowering, a mix of salt, rot and ozone. But he's looking over his shoulder. Welcome to the kelp tax, or the Lord's shore. The lord of the manor whose land touched the beach claimed ownership of the seaweed, even the stuff floating in the water. If you gathered driftweed, floating, you paid. If you cut growing weed, attached to rocks, you paid double. The sensory reality is the weight. Wet seaweed is incredibly heavy. You're hauling it for miles, you're soaked, you smell like a tide pool, and half of your harvest goes to a man who is currently sitting in a warm library, miles away. You're paying a tax on the debris of the ocean. But if the seaweed was taxed, surely the sand was free. The ballast stage. Ships needed weight to stay upright when they were empty. They used sand or gravel. Ballast. They dug it from the riverbed or the beach. But the king claimed the riverbed. The sensory detail is the shovel. You're a sailor. You're standing in the mud of the Thames or the Tyne. You're digging wet, heavy sand into a basket to load onto your ship. The ballast master watches. He charges you for the dirt. And when you arrive at the next port and want to dump the sand to load cargo, you pay lastage to dump it. You pay to pick it up and you pay to throw it away. You're renting the mud. But the most passive tax on the water was the anchorage. You sail your ship into a harbour, you drop your anchor, splash. The iron hook sinks into the mud. The harbour master rows out. Anchorage, he says. I am not touching the dock, you say. You're touching the bottom, he replies. The bottom belongs to the city. You pay a fee for friction, for the act of stopping. But the most poetic tax on the sea was the light dues. Lighthouses. They saved lives. They warned of rocks, but they were private businesses. If your ship sailed past a lighthouse, even if it was day, even if you didn't look at it, you paid. The collectors checked the shipping logs. You passed the Eddystone light, they said. It was noon, you protest. The light was off. You paid. For the potential of light, they say. It was a subscription service for safety. But let's leave the sea and go back to the city. to the alleyways where the gin flows. In the 18th century, the government tried to tax gin out of existence. They charged massive license fees to sellers, $50, an impossible sum. So the sellers went underground, and they invented the Puss and Mew, the world's first vending machine. Imagine the sensory experience. You're walking down a dark alley in London. You see a window. In the window is a wooden carving of a cat. You whisper to the cat, "Puss?" A voice from behind the wall, the seller whispers back, "Mew." This is the code. It means the coast is clear, no tax man. You put a coin in the cat's mouth. It slides down a tube. A moment later, a lead pipe sticking out of the cat's paw pours a shot of gin. You catch it in your mouth or a cup. The gin is warm, tasting of turpentine and juniper. It burns your throat. You have bought illegal liquor from a mechanical cat to avoid a $50 license. The sensory reality is the secrecy, the smell of the alley, the click of the coin, the burn of the spirit. It is a transaction of pure defiance. But the government didn't just tax the vice, they taxed the cure. The medicine stamp duty. In 1783, Britain taxed patent medicines. If you sold a bottle of Dr. So-and-so's miracle cure, you had to pay. So, apothecaries stopped claiming their medicines cured anything. They sold elixir, tincture, cordial. They removed the instructions, they removed the promises. The sensory result is the mystery bottle. You're sick. You buy a bottle of brown liquid. It has no label telling you what it does. You smell it. It smells like licorice and opium. What is this for, you ask? The apothecary winks. It is for general wellness. He can't say cough cure or he pays the tax. You are drinking a mystery because the truth is taxable. But the most visual tax on status was the armorial bearings duty, a tax on coats of arms. If you painted your family crest on your carriage or engraved it on your silver spoons, you paid. The sensory reality is the scrape. You're a minor gentleman. You're broke. You can't afford the tax. You go out to your carriage house. You take a knife. You scrape the paint off the door. The lion, rampant, the symbol of your family's honour for 3 centuries, flakes away in chips of red and gold paint. You are erasing your identity to save 2 guineas. You look at your silver spoons. You call the silversmith. Melt them down, you say, or grind off the crest. The sound of the grinding wheel. The dust of silver. You're becoming anonymous by financial necessity. But the king didn't just tax your crest. He taxed your time. We talked about the clock tax, but let's look at the sundial. When clocks were taxed, people went back to sundials, but you can't put a sundial in your pocket. So the sensory experience of the city changed. People stopped looking at their wrists. They looked at the church towers. They looked at the shadows. Meet me when the shadow of the market cross touches the tavern door. Society regressed to solar time, and as you stand there, watching the shadow lengthen, drinking your illegal cat gin, holding your labelless medicine, wearing your crestless coat, you realise the tax code is a sculptor. It chips away at the edges of daily life until the shape of society changes. But the night is coming again. And there is one final tax we haven't covered, one that hits the very act of leaving the country. The passport fee? No, that's modern. The neexiat regno. Let him not leave the kingdom, a writ that prevented you from leaving. To lift it? You paid. You were a prisoner of geography. But tomorrow is Plough Monday. The day the agricultural year begins, and the day the plough arms are due. A penny for every plough team. The cycle begins again. Plough Monday, the first Monday after Epiphany. The Christmas feast is over. The last of the goose has been eaten. The ale barrel is empty. The holidays are finished. It is time to work. But before you can put the ploughshare into the frozen earth, you have to perform the ritual and pay the fee, the plough arms or the plough light, a tax of 1 penny per plough team paid to the church to keep a candle burning before the altar. The sensory reality of Plough Monday is the drag. You and your neighbours hook yourselves to the heavy wooden plough. There are no oxen today. The men are the oxen. You drag the plough through the village streets. The wood scrapes loudly against the cobblestones and the hard-packed mud. Scrape. Thud. You are full ploughing. You dance. You shout. You beg for coins from the wealthy houses. A penny for the plough. Boys, you cry, your breath pluming in the frigid air. If they give you money, good. You can buy ale. If they don't, you plough up their front garden. It is sanctioned vandalism, a brief moment where the labour force threatens the elite, but the penny for the church, that is mandatory. The priest wants his candle. He wants the light of God to shine on the agricultural year, and he wants you to pay for the wax. You are paying a subscription fee for the hope of a harvest. But once the ploughing starts, the real theft begins, not of your money, but of your soil's nutrients. The right of foldage. Sheep produce two things, wool and manure. Both are valuable. The wool clothes you. The manure feeds your crops. But in many manners, the Lord held the right of foldage. This meant that every night you had to bring your sheep to the Lord's land and pen them there. Why? So they would poop on his field. The sensory experience is the evening walk. The sun is setting, casting long purple shadows across the downs. It is cold. You want to pen your sheep in your own small garden to enrich your own turnips. But the bailiff is watching. To the Lord's fold, he commands. You herd the animals. The smell of lanolin and sheep dung is thick and musky. You lock them in the Lord's hurdles. All night your sheep fertilize the Lord's wheat. Your own field remains barren, hungry, pale. You are owning the animal, but the Lord is harvesting its biology. It is a tax on digestion. But if the Lord stole the manure, the king stole the very measurements of the market again. The alnager returns, but this time let's look at the sealing fee. Cloth was sold by the bolt, but how long is a bolt? The king decided it was whatever the alnager said it was, but the sensory horror was the stretching. Dishonest weavers, or weavers trying to pay the tax, would stretch the wet wool on tenterhooks, hooks on a wooden frame, to make it longer. You walk past the tenter grounds on the edge of the town. You see hundreds of yards of cloth stretched tight, groaning under the tension. The fabric thins, it weakens. If you stretch it too much, it tears. The alnager inspects it. He looks through the fabric at the sun. Too thin, he says. Defective. He cuts it. He fines you. You stretched your labour to meet the tax and it broke. But let's leave the industry and go to the courtroom, because the most boring tax of all was the tax on boredom itself. The suit of court. You were legally required to attend the Lord's manorial court every 3 weeks, even if you had no business there, even if you hadn't committed a crime, even if you didn't want to sue anyone, you had to go, just to be counted. The sensory reality is the drone. You're standing in the great hall. It is draughty. The floor is cold stone. The steward sits on the dais, reading a list of names in a monotonous voice. John of the Green? Here. William the Smith? Here. You stand there for hours. You are losing a day of work. The harvest is waiting, the rain is coming, but you're stuck in a room listening to 2 neighbours argue about a fence post. If you didn't show up, you were à merced, fined, in mercy. That was the legal term. You were in the Lord's mercy, which meant he could fine you whatever he wanted. It was a tax on presence, a mandatory attendance policy for adulthood. But sometimes the court wasn't in the hall. It was in the forest, the wood moat, the court of the forest. If you were caught with vert and green wood, or venison, deer meat, you were dragged here. But the true absurdity was the expeditation. We mentioned the lawing of dogs, cutting off the claws, but there was a tax to avoid it. The dog silver. If you paid the forester, you could keep your dog's claws. Imagine the transaction. You love your dog. A scruffy lurcher who sleeps by your fire. The forester holds a chisel. 3 shillings, he says, or I cut the paw. You pay. You're paying a ransom for your pet's anatomy. It highlights the cruelty of the revenue stream. It targeted what you loved. But let's move to a tax that targeted what you feared. The leper's toll. Lepers were outcasts, but they had rights. In some towns, they had the right to a toll on corn sold in the market. They would stand at the gate with a clapper, a wooden rattle, and a bowl on a long pole. Alms for the Lazar, they chanted. Merchants paid them to go away, to avoid the contagion. The sensory experience is the avoidance, the sound of the rattle, click-clack, the sight of the bandaged face, the smell of rotting flesh masked by vinegar. You throw a coin into the bowl, you don't touch the bowl, you hold your breath. It was a tax levied by horror, but surely the king couldn't tax the wind. We talked about windmills. But what about music in the wind? The piper's fee. In some Scottish burghs, the town hired a piper. He played every morning to wake the town, and every evening to signal curfew, and every household had to pay him. Even if you hated bagpipes, the sensory reality, It is 5 a.m, it is dark, it is freezing. Scree! The sound of the pipes pierces your skull. It is loud, droning, relentless. You wake up with a jolt. You're paying a man to ruin your sleep. But let's end this section with the most fundamental tax of all. The tax on the ground you stand on. The terrage. This was a tax on the earth itself, not the crops. The dirt. If you set a basket of fruit on the ground in the market, you paid terrage. If you parked a cart, terrage. If you stood still for too long, the beetle might ask for terrage. The sensory detail is the hover. You're holding a heavy basket of apples. Your arms are shaking. You want to put it down. But if you put it down, it costs a penny. So you hold it. You shift your weight. You sweat. You're playing a game of the floor is lava, but the lava is a tax. And as you stand there, holding your heavy burden, listening to the bagpipes you didn't ask for, smelling the sheep dung you gave away for free, and rubbing the coin you paid to save your dog's toes, you realise the medieval world was a place where gravity, biology and acoustics were all properties of the state. But the night is coming. The sun is dipping below the horizon, and tomorrow is Hocktide, a festival where the women tie up the men and demand a ransom. It sounds fun, but the church takes the money. Hocktide. The second Monday and Tuesday after Easter. The winter is over. The sap is rising. And the village is preparing for a festival that feels less like a celebration and more like a sanctioned hostage situation. This was one of the few times when the power dynamic of the medieval world flipped. But of course, it flipped in a way that generated revenue. On Monday, the men captured the women. On Tuesday, the women captured the men. They would tie them up with ropes or block the roads and demand a ransom. Hock money. The sensory reality is chaotic. Laughter, screaming, the rough texture of hemp rope binding your wrists. The women of the village, usually silent and subservient, are suddenly a coordinated gang. They surround the sheriff. They surround the priest. They surround you. Pay or stay bound, they shout. You pay, a few pennies. And where does the money go? To the church wardens, for the repair of the church roof. It was a tax disguised as a flirtation, a way to monetize gender relations. The church allowed the disorder because it profited from the result. But if Hocktide was a game, the tithes of milk were deadly serious. We talked about grain tithes, but milk? You couldn't just give the priest a bucket of milk, it would spoil. So you had to make cheese. Tithe cheese. The sensory detail is the press. You're in the dairy. It smells of sour milk and rennet. You're pressing the cheese for the priest, but you know he won't eat it immediately, it has to last. So you make it hard, dry, salty. The parson's cheese became a byword for something inedible, a cheese so hard you could use it as a wheel chock. You handed over the stone-hard wheel. The priest took it. He probably sold it to the poor. It was a transfer of calcium from the udders of your cow to the coffers of the church. But let's move to a tax that targeted the very structure of your house again. The smoke silver. Revisiting this, but with a new twist. In some areas the tax wasn't on the chimney but on the hole in the roof. If you covered the hole to keep the rain out, you were concealing a hearth. The sensory experience is the eye. The tax collector climbs onto your roof. He looks down the hole. He feels the heat rising. He is looking into the intimate heart of your home from above. It is a violation of vertical privacy. But if the roof was taxed, the floor was regulated. The rushing. Covering the floor with rushes, reeds, was essential for hygiene or masking the lack of it. But you couldn't just cut rushes anywhere. The marsh toll. If you went to the riverbank to cut reeds, the Lord charged you. The sensory reality is the swish of the sickle. You are knee-deep in the fen. The reeds are tall, green, whispering in the wind. You cut them. They fall with a soft sigh. You bundle them. They are heavy, wet. You pay the toll. You carry them. Home. You spread them on your dirt floor. For a few days your house smells like a summer meadow. Then it smells like rot. You paid for a perfume that turned into compost. But let's talk about a tax that hit the traveller. The travers. A toll for passing through a town with a cart. But unlike murage, for walls, or pavage, for paving, travers was often just for the Lord. The sensory detail is the chain. You arrive at the market town. A heavy iron chain is stretched across the street. The chainkeeper sits in a booth. He is eating an apple. Travers, he says. What is it for, you ask? For the chain, he says. You pay to have the obstacle removed. The obstacle that was only put there to make you pay. It is the purest form of rent-seeking. But the most bizarre tax on movement was the foot washing. In monasteries that offered hospitality to pilgrims, the monks would wash the feet of the travellers. It was a biblical act of humility. But in some corrupt houses the monks expected a tip, the sensory irony. You are a pilgrim. You have walked to Canterbury. Your feet are blistered, dirty, sore. The monk kneels. He washes your feet in warm water. It feels divine. Then he holds out a bowl. "For the basin," he whispers, "if you don't pay." The water gets colder for the next guy. It was a monetization of humility. But let's end this section with the tax that targeted the most useless thing of all, the playing card again, but specifically the tax on dice. In 1711, Britain taxed dice. You had to take your dice to the stamp office. They would stamp them with a tiny crown. The sensory reality is the balance. You are a gambler. You buy a pair of stamped dice, but the stamp removes a tiny bit of ivory. It changes the weight. The dice are loaded by the government. You throw them. They tumble. They land on a number. Is it luck? Or is it the tax code influencing the physics of the roll? And as you stand there, holding your stamped dice, smelling the rushes rotting on your floor, watching the smoke rise through the taxed hole in your roof, you realize the state is everywhere. It is in the game. It is in the roof. It is in the cheese. But the night is deep. The Hocktide women have untied the sheriff. The Plough Monday boys have gone to sleep. You are alone. But tomorrow the window peeper is coming back, and he has a ladder. Sleep well. The ladder scrapes against the stone wall of your cottage. Scrape. Thud. It is a sound that sets your teeth on edge. It is the sound of the window peeper. The window tax has created a new profession. A man paid to climb. A man paid to count. He is not looking for you. He's looking for glass. You sit inside in the gloom. You have bricked up one window, but you left the other. It is small, just a slit really, letting in a single beam of dusty light that illuminates the floating particles, a flower in the air. Suddenly the light is blocked. A face appears at the glass. It is distorted by the imperfections of the medieval pane, a giant peering eye. He is checking if you have unblocked the other window. He is counting the panes. The sensory reality is the invasion of light. The sun is yours. The view is yours. But the aperture through which you see it belongs to the king. The face at the window is a reminder that there is no wall thick enough to keep the state out. He climbs down, you hear his boots hit the mud, you exhale, you have passed the audit. But if the window was a liability, the boat was a trap. Let's go down to the harbour, to the keelage. You're a fisherman. You have a small boat tarred black to keep out the water. You have been out all night. Your hands are numb, your nets are empty. You row back to the shore. You throw a rope around a wooden post on the dock. Keelage, the harbour master says. I didn't unload. Anything, you say. I caught nothing. The keel touched the bottom, he says, and the rope touches the post. You pay for the friction of the rope against the wood. You pay for the knot. It is a tax on stopping. If you kept rowing forever, you would be free. But the moment you land, you owe. And if you tried to pull the boat up onto the beach instead, strandage, the tax for beaching a vessel, you are paying for the sand. But surely the church was kinder. Surely the sacraments were free, the banns of marriage. You want to marry the miller's daughter, if he approves, and if you pay the merchant. But first, you have to be asked. For 3 Sundays in a row, the priest must read your names out loud in church. I publish the banns of marriage, but he doesn't do it for free. The sensory experience is the waiting. You stand in the nave. The air is cold. The congregation is listening. You are nervous. What if someone objects? What if the priest forgets? You paid the asking fee. If you couldn't afford the fee, you couldn't get married. You lived in sin. And then the summoner would come and fine you for fornication. It was a bureaucratic trap. Pay to marry or pay for not marrying. But the church didn't just tax the wedding. It taxed the bread of the Mass, the holy loaf. In many parishes, the cost of the communion bread, the wafers, was not borne by the church funds. It was a rotating duty. Every Sunday, a different household had to provide the holy loaf, or pay the holy loaf silver so the priest could buy it. The sensory detail is the baking. It is Saturday night. You are tired, but you have to heat the oven. You have to use your best white flour, which you can't afford to eat yourself. You bake the loaf. It smells rich, yeasty, divine. You take it to the church. You hand it over. You watch the priest eat it, or consecrate it. You're hungry, but you have fed the liturgy. It was a tax on your own salvation. But let's leave the spiritual and go back to the brutal reality of the road. The wheel lock. In the mountains or on steep hills, wagons needed brakes. They used slipper shoes or drag shoes, metal plates under the wheels to create friction. But the friction damaged the Lord's road, so there was a tax on drags. If you used a brake to stop your cart from careening off a cliff, you paid extra. The sensory reality is the speed. You're going downhill, the cart is heavy, the horses are struggling to hold it back. You want to drop the brake, but you think of the tax. You hold on. You risk the crash. You risk your neck to save a shilling. The tax code incentivized danger, but the most pervasive tax was the one that was invisible, the inflation of the coin. We talked about the debasement, but the sensory experience of inflation is the light loaf. The price of bread is fixed by the assize, but the money's worth less, so the baker makes the loaf smaller and smaller. You hold the penny loaf in your hand. It feels like a feather. It is mostly air. You eat it in 3 bites. You're still hungry. You've paid the inflation tax with your stomach. And as you stand there, holding your empty hands, listening to the creak of the keelage rope, smelling the holy loaf you can't eat, watching the window peeper climb his ladder, you realise the medieval world was a masterclass in extracting value from nothing. They taxed the light, they taxed the dark, they taxed the stop, they taxed the go. But the night is coming, and the curfew bell is silent tonight. Why? Because the bell is cracked, and the village has to pay the bell rate to fix it. The bell rate. The bell is cracked. It hangs in the tower, a heavy mute mass of bronze. It cannot ring the curfew. It cannot ring the passing bell. It cannot warn of fire. But the church wardens have decided it must be fixed, and the king doesn't pay for bells. You do. The bell rate is levied on the parish. The sensory reality is the melting. You watch the itinerant bell founder set up his pit in the churchyard. He builds a furnace of clay and brick. He lights a roaring fire. He demands metal. Old pewter plates, he says, broken tools, a silver spoon for the tone. You have to throw your own household items into the crucible. You watch your pewter mug melt into a silvery sludge. You smell the hot metal, the charcoal smoke, the sweat of the founder. You're literally pouring your domestic life into a noise you will have to pay to hear later. But if the bell was a tax on sound, the wax Scott was a tax on light. We mentioned the honey tax, but the church needed holy light. Every parishioner had to pay wax Scott 3 times a year to buy beeswax candles for the altar. The sensory detail is the drip. You're kneeling in the church. It is Easter. The great Paschal candle is burning. It is massive, thick as a man's thigh, smelling of honey and purity. It drips. A glob of hot wax hits the stone floor. You watch it harden. That glob cost you a day's wages. You want to scrape it up and take it home, but that would be sacrilege. You are paying for a light that illuminates the priest while you sit in the shadows. But let's leave the church and go back to the market, to the ground itself, the market sweepings. If you were a grain merchant and your sack burst, if the wheat spilled onto the cobblestones, you couldn't sweep it up. Once it touched the ground, it belonged to the lord of the market. The sensory horror is the waste. You watch the golden grain scatter in the mud. You drop to your knees to scoop them up. The beadle stops you. He hits your hand with his staff. The Lord's grain, he says. He sweeps it up later. He feeds it to his pigs. You have lost your profit to the law of gravity. And speaking of the ground, let's talk about the right of way again, but specifically the through toll. If you drove cattle through a town without stopping, you still paid. The sensory experience is the hurry. You are a drover. You have 50 cows. You're trying to get them through the narrow streets of a walled town before the sun sets. The cows are panicked by the noise. They slip on the stones. The toll collector stands at the far gate. He counts the cows. 50 heads, he says. 50 pence. We didn't stop, you shout. We didn't sell anything. You use the street, he says. You breathe the air. You pay. You're paying for the friction of the hooves on stone. But the most cynical tax on movement was the marriage of the unfree. If you were a serf and you wanted to marry a woman from another manor, the formariage, marriage outside the fee, the Lord hated this. He was losing a brood mare in his eyes. He was losing the future labour of your children, so the fine was massive. The sensory reality is the negotiation. You stand before the steward. You're in love. You want to marry the girl from the next valley. £3, the steward says. That is 3 years of wages. You look at him, you look at your empty hands, you go back to your village, you marry a girl you don't love because she is free. Or rather, she is free to you because she belongs to the same owner. It was a tax on genetic diversity, a tax on the human heart. But if you couldn't marry out, could you at least grind your own grain in secret? We return to the hand mill. The Lord's men are searching the village again. They are looking for the querns, the handstones, the sensory experiences, the smash. They find your mill. You hid it under the hay, but they found it. They take it out to the village green. The blacksmith brings a heavy hammer. Crack. They shatter the stone. The dust flies. The sound is the sound of your independence breaking. They make you pave your floor with the broken pieces. A constant reminder. Every time you walk across your kitchen, you step on the ruins of your autonomy. But there is one final tax for this section, one that targets the very end of the line, the heriot of the priest. We know the Lord took the best cow, but did you know the bishop often took the priest's best horse when the priest died? Even the tax collectors were taxed. The sensory irony. The old priest is dead. His horse, a faithful mare that carried him to sickbeds for 20 years, stands in the paddock. The bishop's man arrives. He takes the horse. The new priest has to walk. It was a food chain of extraction. The peasant feeds the priest. The priest feeds the bishop. The bishop feeds the pope. And as you stand there, walking on your broken millstones, watching the bishop ride away on the priest's horse, smelling the wasted grain in the market and listening to the bell you paid to fix, you realize the system is a pyramid, and you are the stone at the bottom, crushed by the weight of the gold at the top. But the sun is setting. The curfew rings again, louder now with the new metal. You go inside. You're safe until tomorrow, when the salt runs out and you have to meet the gabalus. The salt box is empty. You scrape your fingernails against the rough wood of the bottom, gathering a few stray white crystals. They are precious. They are more valuable than the iron pot they sit next to. You need salt. Your body craves it. Your soup tastes like hot water and sadness without it. Your meat will rot without it. But you cannot just buy it. You have to face the gabalus. The gabelle, the French salt tax, was not just a financial burden, it was a military occupation of the kitchen. The gabelous were the tax police. They were armed, they were hated, and they had the right to enter your home at any time to search for faux sel, false salt, salt that hadn't been taxed. The sensory reality of a visit from the gabalus is the tasting. You are cooking dinner. The door bursts open. 3 men in uniforms enter. They don't look at you, they look at your pot. One of them dips a ladle into your soup. He sips. "Salty," he says accusingly. "I bought the salt from the king's warehouse," you cry. "Show me the receipt," he demands, "and show me the pot." He checks the level of salt in your mandatory storage jar. If you have too much left, you didn't use your quota. Fined. If you have too little, you bought illegal salt. Fined. He searches the house. He pokes his bayonet into your mattress. He looks in the ashes of the hearth. He checks the pockets of your children. It is a violation of the domestic sphere so total that it leaves you shaking. But if you tried to smuggle salt, to buy it cheap in Brittany, where there was no tax, and bring it to Anjou, where the tax was high, you became a faux saunier, a false salter. The sensory experience of the smuggler is the chafe. You're walking through the woods at night. You have a bag of salt strapped to your chest under your shirt. The salt absorbs your sweat. It becomes damp, the brine leaks out, it rubs your skin raw. You are burned by the very commodity you're trying to save. If they catch you, the galleys. We mentioned them before, but let's look at the branding. Before they send you to the ships, they mark you. The executioner heats an iron. It is shaped like the fleur-de-lis, or the letters gal, sizzle, the smell of burning skin, the permanence of the scar. You are marked as property of the state's vengeance. You are sent to the Mediterranean. You row until you die. Your body is thrown into the sea, the ultimate source of the salt you died for. It was a cycle of saline tragedy. But let's leave the salt and look at the shoes on your feet. The leather tax. In various periods, leather was taxed by the hide. But how do you prove a hide has been taxed? The stamp. The tanner had to wait for the excise man to stamp the hide before he could cut it. If you were a cobbler and you were caught with unstamped leather, the sensory reality is the confiscation. You're stitching a boot. The leather smells of tannin and wax. The exciseman walks in. He picks up a scrap of leather from the floor. "No stamp," he says. "It was on the edge I cut off," you argue. "Likely story," he says. He takes your leather, he takes your tools, he takes the half-finished boot. You are left holding a needle and thread, staring at your bare feet. But if the shoes were taxed, the road they walked on was a gauntlet. The turnpike again. But specifically, the ticket. You pay the toll. You get a ticket. A small slip of paper. You have to keep it. If you lose it before the next gate, you pay again. The sensory detail is the clutch. You're riding in the rain. You're holding the tiny wet piece of paper in your hand. You're terrified of dropping it. It is dissolving in your grip. You're guarding a receipt with your life. But let's look at a tax that targeted the very air you breathed if you were dead. The burial tax. Again, but the registration of it. In 1783, Britain taxed the entry of a death in the register, so the poor stopped registering deaths. They buried their dead in unconsecrated ground, in the woods, in the garden. The sensory reality is the secret grave. It is midnight. You are digging a hole behind the barn. You are burying your infant child. You cannot afford the tax. You cannot afford the priest. You fill in the earth. You stomp it down. You cover it with straw so the neighbours don't see. You are denying your child a name in the book of history to save 3 pence. It is the ultimate erasure. But let's end this section with a tax that sounds like a joke, but caused a war. The Stamp Act, American version. We know the story. Tea, taxes, revolution. But the sensory reality of the Stamp Act wasn't just tea. It was dice. It was cards. It was calendars. Everything you touched had a stamp on it. You pick up a newspaper, stamp. You pick up a diploma, stamp. You pick up a will, stamp. It was a visual plague. The king's crown was stamped on every interaction you had with the world. And the colonists looked at the stamps and they looked at the harbour and they decided that tea tastes better with salt water than with taxes. And as you stand there, watching the tea crates float in the harbour, smelling the salt air, taxed, wearing your stamped leather shoes, holding your stamped newspaper, you realise the breaking point isn't hunger, it isn't cold, it is the annoyance. It is the sheer, grinding, repetitive annoyance of being asked for a penny every time you try to live. But the night is deep. The gabblers have gone back to their barracks to eat their salty soup. You are safe until tomorrow. When the hearth money man comes back, and he has a list. The hearth money man has a list, but the sheriff has a stone. We have talked about paying with money. We have talked about paying with labour. We have talked about paying with dignity. But there is one tax avoidance strategy that requires paying with your life in the most agonising way possible to save your children's inheritance. The peine forte et dure, the strong and hard punishment. Here is the legal trap. If you were accused of a felony, like theft or murder, and you were tried and found guilty, the king confiscated all your property. Your family was left destitute. The land, the house, the cows, all gone to the crown. But you could only be tried if you entered a plea. Guilty or not guilty, if you refused to speak, if you stood silent, the trial could not start. You could not be convicted. Your property could not be seized. So, brave men, fathers thinking of their starving children, chose the mute of malice. They refused to speak. The law's response was the press. The sensory reality is the weight. You're taken to the dungeon. You're laid on your back on the cold stone floor. A sharp stone or a piece of timber is placed under your spine. Then they place a board on your chest. And then they add the weights. Iron, stone, lead. Will you plead? The sheriff asks. You stare at the ceiling. You clamp your jaw shut. You think of your son. If you speak, he loses the farm. If you stay silent, he keeps it. They add more weight. Your ribs crack, snap. The sound is loud in the small room. Your breath comes in shallow, whistling gasps. Your eyes bulge. They give you bad bread and stagnant water on alternate days, just to keep you alive longer to suffer. Plead, the sheriff shouts. You shake your head. You are dying. But you are dying a landowner. It was the ultimate sacrifice, a man allowing himself to be crushed to death by the weight of the law, just to ensure the taxman didn't get his estate. It is a tax loophole made of bone and iron. But let's leave the dungeon and go to the very edge of the jurisdiction, the in-fang thief and out-fang thief. These sound like fantasy monsters, but they were feudal rights granted to a lord. In-fang thief meant the lord had the right to hang a thief caught inside his territory. Out-fang thief meant he could go outside his territory, catch a thief, bring him back, and hang him. Why did the lord want this? Because he got the thief stuff, the chattels. If the king sheriff caught the thief, the king got the stuff. If the lord caught him, the lord got the stuff. So, there was a race. The sensory experience is the pursuit. You are the thief. You have stolen a silver cup. You're running. Behind you, you hear two groups of horses. One is the sheriff. One is the lord's bailiff. They aren't racing to bring you to justice. They are racing to see who gets your boots. You are a piñata of assets, and they are the children with the sticks. But let's look at a tax that targeted the very structure of the market again. The beam, the king's beam. We talked about the tron for wool, but the beam was for avoirdupois goods, heavy goods, lead, wax, spices. The king demanded that all heavy goods be weighed on his beam in London. Even if you were selling them in Bristol, you had to transport your goods hundreds of miles just to have them weighed, taxed, and then transported back. The sensory reality is the ruts, the wheels of your cart grinding into the mud, the oxen exhausting themselves. You're moving lead across the country for no reason other than bureaucratic centralisation. The roads are ruined by the weight. The cost of lead goes up, the roof of the church stays unrepaired because the lead is too expensive. It was a tax on logistics. But surely the king couldn't tax the water you drank, the conduit. In London, water was brought in by wooden pipes, conduits. It was a public service. But the water bearers, men who carried water to houses, formed a guild. They charged a monopoly price, and the city charged the guild. The sensory experience is the bucket. You are thirsty. You go to the conduit. The water bearer blocks your way. He is strong, wet, smelling of river mud. 2p a tankard, he says. I can carry it myself, you say. Against the rules, he says, you pay him to carry water 10 feet. It was a tax on hydration. But the most subtle tax was the one on usury. Lending money at interest was a sin. It was illegal for Christians. But people needed loans. Kings needed loans. So they allowed Jewish lenders, before the expulsion, or Italian bankers, after, to lend money. But the king taxed the lenders heavily. So the lenders raised the interest rates. You, the peasant borrowing money to buy seed corn, paid 40% interest. Why? Because the king took 20%. The sensory reality is the notch. You watch the moneylender carve the notch into the tally stick. It is deep. It cuts through the wood. 40%, he says, the king's share. You're paying the king for the permission to be in debt. And as you stand there, holding the split tally stick, feeling the weight of the press on your chest, metaphorically, hopefully, listening to the race of the sheriff and the bailiff, smelling the stagnant water of the conduit, you realise the medieval world was a place where every exit was a toll booth. But the night is almost over. The passing bell has stopped ringing. The curfew is lifted. There is one final tax, the one that waits at the very end of time. The Doomsday Book, not a tax, but a survey. William the Conqueror wanted to know exactly what he owned. Every pig, every plough, every acre. He sent his men to every village. Who owns this? How much is it worth? The sensory experience was the interrogation. The villagers stood in the square. They were terrified. They felt like it was the last judgment, hence doomsday. The scribe wrote it all down, and once it was written, it was law. You couldn't argue. The book says you have 3 cows, the sheriff says. 1 died, you cry. The book says 3. Pay for 3. It was a tax on a memory of wealth, a static snapshot of a dynamic world. And as you close your eyes, preparing for the final rest of the night, you see the book. It is heavy, bound in leather, chained to a desk in Westminster. It has your name in it, or your ancestor's name, and a number. That number is your destiny. But you have survived the book. You have survived the press. You have survived the gabalus. The night is done. The sun is rising on a new era. An era of income tax, sales tax, and property tax. Different names. Same squeeze. But for now, in the quiet of the morning, before the world wakes up to demand its due, you are free. Take a breath. It's on the house. The fire in the hearth has finally burned down to a soft white ash. The glow is gone. The heat is fading, leaving behind a cool, still silence in the room. The shadows that danced on the walls have settled into the corners, heavy and motionless. You're no longer the peasant standing in the mud. You're no longer the merchant hiding his silver, or the widow riding the ram, or the baker sweating over the king's herring pies. The long, exhausting day of the Middle Ages is over. The tax collector has put away his ledger, his ink has dried, his quill is laid to rest. He too is asleep, dreaming perhaps of a world where he can tax the clouds. The king has taken off his crown, the weight of it, the gold, the jewels, the responsibility, the greed, is sitting on a velvet cushion. He is just a man in a nightshirt snoring in a draughty castle that he paid for with your ward penny. The eels are sleeping in the mud of the river, safe from the steward's basket. The bees are huddled together in the hive, their wings still, their honey safe for the night. The smoke has drifted away into the sky, joining the clouds where no law can reach it. You can let go of the anxiety now. The window tax cannot see you in the dark. The beard tax cannot touch you under the blanket. The silence of the night is not a taxable commodity. As you lie there, feeling the weight of the modern duvet, softer than wool, lighter than straw, you can appreciate the profound luxury of simply existing without a fee. The history we have walked through tonight was a history of struggle. It was a history of absurdity. It was a testament to the incredible creativity of the powerful when it comes to taking from the powerless. But it was also a history of survival. Despite the poll tax, the people lived. Despite the salt tax, they ate. Despite the window tax, they found light. Humanity is stubborn. We build loopholes, we hide pennies, we paint fake windows, we endure. And now your endurance is rewarded with rest. The ledger is closed, the tally sticks are burned, the debt is forgiven for the night. Take a deep breath. Inhale the air that belongs to no one. Feel your chest rise and fall. That rhythm is yours. It is the one thing the state could never quite figure out how to meter. Let your shoulders drop. The yoke of the ox is gone. The weight of the harvest is gone. The world outside is still complicated. The modern taxman is still waiting. The bureaucracy is still humming in the background, a machine of paper and digital codes. But in this room, in this moment, there is only quiet. There is no toll bridge between you and sleep. There is no gatekeeper demanding a fee for your dreams. You're free to drift, to float away from the hard earth, away from the mud and the stone, into the soft, untaxed darkness. Village is sleeping, the castle is sleeping, the history books are closed, you have survived the system. Now rest. Good night.